Was Julius Caesar a statesman of genius who led Rome out of a deep crisis, or was he a power-obsessed politician who destroyed the Republic once and for all? Write your opinion directly in the comments, because this is exactly the question that accompanies us through the entire story of this man. Hardly any other figure of antiquity is as well known as Caesar to this day. His name stands for power, ambition, military genius, political courage, and at the same time for betrayal, civil war, and the end of an old order. He was no ordinary Roman, not a simple general, nor a ruler who came to the top by chance. Caesar was a man who understood his time, recognized its weaknesses, and was willing to take any risk to force his place in history. But his story does not begin with laurel wreaths, legions, and triumphal processions. It begins in a republic that was already internally torn. Rome was powerful, rich, and feared, but behind the shining facades there were conflicts between the nobility and the people, between tradition and change, between personal ambition and state order. Caesar was born into this world, and it was from it that he shaped his career. In this script, we don't just look at the famous moments, Gaul, the Rubicon, or the Ides of March. We also ask what really drove Caesar. Was it fame? Was it fear of political doom? Was it the desire for reforms? Or was it just the insatiable hunger for power in the end? If you like such historical stories, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any more episodes. And now begins the story of a man whose life changed Rome and whose death steered world history in a new direction. 1. Rome before Caesar. Before Julius Caesar could even become one of the most famous figures in world history, Rome was already an empire full of contradictions. To the outside world, the Republic seemed invincible. Their legions had subjugated large parts of the Mediterranean, defeated powerful enemies, and brought immeasurable riches to Italy. Rome was no longer just a city on the Tiber, but the center of a power that stretched from Spain to Greece, from North Africa to Asia Minor. But it was precisely this tremendous success that had changed the Republic. What had once begun as a community of free citizens, in which offices, laws, and traditions were supposed to ensure a political balance, had become a state in the 1st century BC that threatened to break under the weight of its own greatness. The Roman Republic was based on a mixture of ancient customs, written laws, and political customs. There was no king, because the memory of the expulsion of the Roman kings was a central part of the Roman self-image. Power should never be permanently in the hands of an individual. Consuls were elected for only 1 year, senators deliberated on the great questions of the state, tribunes of the people were supposed to protect the interests of ordinary citizens, and popular assemblies decided laws and elections. On paper, this system seemed balanced. In reality, however, it was strongly influenced by origin, wealth, relationships, and personal influence. The old aristocratic families have determined politics for generations. They saw themselves as the natural leaders of Rome and regarded the state almost as a legacy of their ancestors. But Rome had expanded faster than its political structures could adapt. The conquests brought enormous booty, new provinces, slaves, tax revenues, and trade opportunities. For the upper class, this meant new opportunities to become even richer. Senators, knights, tax collectors, and large landowners profited from the wars and the administration of the provinces. They invested in land, in villas, in businesses, and in political careers. For many simple Romans, however, the situation was different. Numerous small farmers had served in the legions for years, while their farms were neglected. When they returned, they often found themselves in debt or had to sell their land. Large estates, so-called latifundia, spread. Slaves often worked there, who had been brought to Italy en masse during the wars. This created a dangerous social tension. While a few families became richer and richer, many citizens lost their economic basis. This development had not only economic, but also political consequences. The Roman citizen was not just any subject. He saw himself as part of the Republic, as someone who had rights, could vote and fought for Rome in the event of war. But when more and more citizens became impoverished, when they flocked to Rome, lived there without fixed property and were dependent on grain distributions or the support of powerful politicians, then the political culture also changed. Votes could be won, masses influenced, and public assemblies turned into instruments of power. Politicians who presented themselves as advocates of the people were able to win enormous support. At the same time, conservative senators saw it as a threat to the traditional order. This contrast developed into two political directions, which are later often described as popular and optimates. These terms were not parties in the modern sense. There were no fixed party programs, no membership cards, and no closed organization. Rather, it was a matter of political strategies and camps of power. The optimates saw themselves as defenders of the authority of the Senate, the old families, and the traditional order. They distrusted politicians who relied directly on the people's assembly and won over the masses with reforms or grain laws. The populace, on the other hand, often sought their power through the people, through tribunes of the people and public mobilization. They presented themselves as representatives of ordinary citizens, wanted to push through land distribution, debt relief, or political reforms, and thus repeatedly came into conflict with the Senate. Caesar would later learn masterfully to use this popular language, but the foundations for this had been laid long before him. A particularly formative example were the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus in the 2nd century BC. They tried to push through land reforms in favor of impoverished citizens. Their goal was not simply social charity, but the salvation of a civil society whose military and political basis was in danger of disappearing. But their opponents in the Senate saw them as dangerous subversives. Both brothers were killed in outbreaks of political violence. That was a deep cut. For the first time, political violence was used in Rome on a scale that shook the Republic. The message was clear: anyone who questioned the balance of power too much risked not only his career, but his life. In the course of the following decades, violence increasingly became a component of politics. Street fighting, intimidation, armed supporters, and political assassinations no longer became unthinkable. At the same time, the military gained a new significance. In the past, citizens had fought for Rome for a time and then returned to their courts. But with the long wars in distant regions, Rome needed more professional soldiers. The general Gaius Marius, a relative of Caesar's family through marriage connections, played a decisive role in this. He opened up military service more to propertyless citizens, thus making the army an opportunity for advancement for men who otherwise had few prospects. This had enormous consequences. Soldiers became increasingly dependent on their commander, who could provide them with booty, pay, and land after service. Their loyalty was no longer solely to the state, but increasingly to the man who led them. This change was dangerous for the Republic. If a successful general had loyal veterans, enormous prestige, and political ambitions, he could put pressure on the state. This is exactly what was shown in the conflict between Marius and Sulla. Both men stood for a claim to power, military glory, and political toughness. Sulla, representative of the conservative Senate party, finally marched on Rome with his troops. This was a breach of taboo of historical importance. Leading a Roman army against one's own city showed that the Republic had lost its internal borders. Sulla established a dictatorship, had opponents persecuted, expropriated, and killed, published lists of outlaws, and then tried to strengthen the power of the Senate again. But although he pretended to save the old order, he had also severely damaged it. He had proven that political conflicts could be resolved with legions. Caesar grew up in this atmosphere. Rome was a city of grandeur and fear, splendor and uncertainty. Triumphal processions celebrated victories over foreign peoples, while inside families fought for influence. Young nobles learned that fame, eloquence, money, and military success could decide everything. Those who wanted to rise had to win allies, convince voters, intimidate opponents, take on debt, and seize opportunities. Politics was not a quiet administration of the state, but a dangerous game for honor, rank, and survival. The term dignitas, i.e. personal dignity, rank, and reputation, was of central importance to Roman politicians. Equally important was gloria, the fame that could increase a family over generations. For men like Caesar, politics was therefore not only a profession, but fate. At the same time, the Republic was ideologically characterized by a strong mistrust of autocracy. The term king was almost a dirty word in Rome. No one should openly present themselves as a monarch. But paradoxically, the political system repeatedly produced men whose power took on almost royal proportions. Successful generals were given long commands, ruled provinces, had armies and riches, and were revered by their soldiers. The state needed such men, but at the same time feared them. It was precisely in this field of tension that Caesar's career was to develop. Rome before Caesar was therefore not a stable republic that was suddenly destroyed by a single ambitious man. It was a political system that was already riddled with deep cracks. The social contradictions were great. The old ruling class defended its privileges. The people sought protection and care. The armies became more personal. Violence increased, and the rules of the republic were increasingly bent or openly broken. Caesar did not enter an ideal world. He entered an order that seemed powerful on the outside, but was already exhausted inside. His genius was to recognize these weaknesses and use them to his advantage. His tragedy was that he did not solve the crisis, but took it to the extreme. When Caesar was born, Rome was still a republic. When his political career ended, this republic could no longer be saved. But in order to understand why a single man could have such a tremendous effect, one must first understand how fragile the ground on which he stood already was. Caesar was not the origin of all Roman conflicts. He was their most successful player, their most dangerous accelerator, and in the end, their most famous victim. 2. Origin of an ambitious man. Gaius Julius Caesar was born on July 12 or 13 of the year 100 BC into a world in which origin meant everything and at the same time no longer guaranteed everything. His family, the Julii, belonged to the old Roman patriciate, i.e. to those families that traced their origin back to the earliest times of Rome. For a Roman, such descent was not only a private matter, but political capital. Those who came from an old family could refer to ancestors, traditions, religious dignity, and social standing. But in the case of Caesar, this legacy was ambivalent. The Julii had a brilliant name, but no longer the power and wealth that other great families of Rome took for granted. They were old, but not particularly influential. They had dignity, but not an overwhelming political position. It was precisely this tension between great origins and limited real power that shaped Caesar's early years. The Julians traced their ancestry back to Julius, the son of the Trojan hero Aeneas. Aeneas, on the other hand, was considered the son of the goddess Venus in Roman mythology. For Caesar, this legendary origin was later of enormous importance. It allowed him to portray his political role not only as a career of an ambitious man, but as part of an almost divine destiny. Of course, this ancestry was not historically provable, but in Rome it was not only what was true that counted. What counted was also what could be believed, told, and publicly staged. Origin was a tool of power. Caesar later understood better than many others how names, symbols, and religious ideas were used politically. But as a child, this glorious family legend was initially more of a promise than a reality. Caesar's father, also called Gaius Julius Caesar, had held political office, but never reached the absolute top of the republic. His mother Aurelia, on the other hand, was considered an extraordinarily noble, strict, and influential woman. It came from the Aurelian family and was later described by ancient authors as a model of Roman dignity. In a society where men ruled publicly, women's influence was often indirect, but by no means insignificant. Aurelia shaped Caesar's upbringing, his discipline, and probably also his awareness of the fact that personal attitude and public appearance were inextricably linked. Caesar did not grow up in poverty, but neither did he grow up in that overpowering wealth that paved the way for many a young nobleman almost effortlessly. He had to learn early on that a big name alone was not enough. Anyone who really wanted to rise in Rome needed courage, networks, money, oratory skills, political acuity, and the ability to take risks. Decisive for Caesar's political influence was his family's connection to the camp of Gaius Marius. Marius was one of the most important generals of his time, victorious over the Cimbrian Teutons, consul several times and symbolic figure of the political direction that was more strongly based on the people. He was also married to Caesar's Aunt Julia. As a result, Caesar had family ties to a man who was revered by many ordinary citizens but feared by conservative senators. Marius embodied a new form of power. He did not come from the oldest high nobility, but had worked his way to the top through military success and political toughness. For the young Caesar, this figure must have been an impressive lesson. In Rome, origin could help, but fame had to be won. Military success could open political doors that would otherwise have remained closed. But this connection to Marius also became dangerous for Caesar. Marius' great opponent was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a conservative aristocrat and general who won the civil war and established a bloody dictatorship. When Sulla took power in Rome, he settled accounts with his opponents. The so-called proscriptions became a symbol of political cruelty. Names of enemies appeared on lists, their property was confiscated, their murder rewarded. It was a time when political affiliation could be the difference between life and death. Caesar was still young at the time, but he was on the wrong side due to his family connections. His marriage to Cornelia, the daughter of the popular politician Lucius Cornelius Cinna, made him even more suspicious. Cinna had been an important ally of Marius and had temporarily ruled Rome politically. For Sulla, this union was not a harmless family bond, but a sign of political danger. Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce Cornelia. For a young man at the beginning of his career, obedience would have been the safe way. Many had given in to save property, offices, and lives. Caesar, however, refused. This decision was remarkable because it put him in immediate danger. He lost his priesthood as a Flemish Julius, which would have allowed him an honorable, but also severely restricted religious career. His wife's inheritance and parts of his own property were also threatened. More importantly, he had to fear for his life at times. Friends and relatives had to plead with Sulla for him. The dictator is said to have finally given in, but with a famous warning: there is more to Caesar than a Marius. Whether this sentence was exactly as true cannot be proven with certainty, but it expresses how later generations understood Caesar's early attitude. Even at a young age, he appeared as someone who was not easily broken. This episode is central to the understanding of Caesar. She shows not only personal courage, but also a pronounced awareness of dignity and self-assertion. In the Roman upper class, it was crucial not to appear weak. A man who allowed himself to be publicly humiliated could lose his reputation in the long run. Caesar risked a lot, but he retained his personal honor and his connection to the popular camp. At the same time, he learned how brutal political power could be. The state was not a neutral shelter. Those who lost could be expropriated, exiled, or killed. This experience must have had a deep impact on Caesar. Later, he would also be faced with the question of whether he should surrender to his opponents or resort to violence. The memory of Sulla's time showed him that losers in Roman power struggles could rarely hope for leniency. After the danger under Sulla, Caesar left Rome and began his early military career in the East. There he gained his first experience in the service of Roman commanders. He got to know the world beyond Italy, the provinces, the client kings, the military camps, and the political dependencies on which Rome's rule was based. His mission to Bithynia, where he was to ask for support from King Nicomedes, became particularly famous. This stay later gave rise to gossip, which his opponents used against him again and again. In Rome, political vilification was a sharp instrument, and Caesar had to learn early on that a public man was vulnerable not only to deeds but also to rumors. Nevertheless, such attacks hardly harmed his career in the long term. On the contrary, they show how early Caesar was the center of public attention. His outward appearance and appearance also became part of his political impact. Caesar was considered well-groomed, elegant, and self-confident. He paid attention to clothing, style, and body language. Some opponents mocked him as too vain or effeminate, but this impression was deceptive. Behind the elegant surface stood a man of enormous physical resilience and willpower. It was precisely this contrast that made him dangerous. He could appear charming, speak educated, appear cultured, and at the same time show extreme toughness when necessary. He was not a coarse soldier who impressed only by violence, and not a mere orator who shone only in the city. It combined urban elegance, aristocratic pride, political audacity, and military energy. The early death of his father exacerbated Caesar's responsibility. As the head of his family branch, he now had to take care of his own rank, reputation, and future. In Rome, this meant pursuing a public career, winning office, building supporters, and asserting oneself against powerful rivals. But Caesar did not do this carefully and inconspicuously. His urge for greatness became apparent early on. He didn't want to be just another senator among many. He wanted to be visible. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to play a role that corresponded to his name and his own self-image. This ambition was not unusual in Rome. The entire political culture rewarded men who sought fame. But with Caesar, this ambition had a special intensity. So his background gave him two things: a great ambition and a dangerous political legacy. The name of the Julii was reminiscent of Rome's oldest past, but Caesar's proximity to Marius and Cinna linked it to the bloody conflicts of the recent past. He could invoke aristocratic dignity and at the same time appear as a man who was closer to the people than many conservative senators. This dual identity later became one of his greatest strengths. He was noble enough to be taken seriously in the highest politics, but not so firmly anchored in the conservative power bloc that he had to accept its rules completely. He could invoke tradition and promise change. He could speak the language of the old families and at the same time awaken the hopes of the masses. When Caesar entered his political career, he already had the experience of a torn republic. He had seen how quickly power could change. He had experienced that origin could protect, but also endanger. He had learned that courage and staging were essential for survival. He knew that political opponents could not only debate, but destroy. And he understood better and better that Rome rewarded men who thought big and were willing to cross borders. The young patrician who had resisted Sulla slowly became a politician who saw his origins not as a comfortable inheritance, but as a mission. Caesar did not want to be in the shadow of his ancestors. He wanted to surpass them. This was precisely the core of his being, an almost insatiable hunger for fame, recognition, and power, born of an old name, personal danger, and a republic in which only the strongest determined history. 3. The young Caesar on the way to the top. When Caesar returned more strongly to the public life of Rome after the dangerous years under Sulla, he was not yet a man who ruled over legions or made the Senate tremble. He was a young aristocrat with a big name, an ambitious eye, and limited resources. But it was precisely this mixture that made him so attentive to every occasion. In Rome, the path to power did not lead over a single big leap, but over many steps. A man had to show himself, talk, serve, give, fight, attack opponents, win friends, intimidate enemies, and prove again and again that he was more than just the son of his family. Caesar understood this world early on. He understood that politics in Rome did not take place only in courtrooms, but in public places, in courts, at games, in the army, at funerals, in private networks, and in the expectations of a population that loved grand gestures. An important step on this path was his training as a speaker. In the Roman Republic, oratory was not an ornament, but a weapon. Whoever could convince in court, in the Senate, or before the people's assembly had power. Words could destroy careers, influence judgments, move masses, and humiliate political opponents. Caesar took this art seriously. After early experiences in the East, he went to Rhodes to refine his rhetorical skills with the famous teacher Apollonios Molon. Rhodes was considered one of the centers of Greek education, and for Roman aristocrats, Greek culture was an important part of political elegance. A Roman statesman not only had to be able to fight, but also appear educated, know historical examples, understand philosophical allusions, and use his voice in such a way that it radiated authority. Caesar learned to speak with clarity, speed, and sharpness. Later, even opponents would acknowledge that he was an extraordinary stylist. His language was not overloaded, but precise, controlled, and effective. It was precisely this ability that was to help him turn military acts into political effect. On the way to Rhodes, an episode occurred that even in ancient times almost seemed like a story about Caesar's character, his capture by pirates. In the eastern Mediterranean, pirates were a serious threat at the time. Roman expansion had subjugated many empires, but had not created stable order everywhere. Pirates operated especially in the waters of Asia Minor and the Aegean, hijacking merchant ships, abducting people, and extorting ransom. Caesar fell into their hands. But instead of behaving like a frightened prisoner, he appeared with a self-confident superiority that impressed his companions and probably also the pirates. When they demanded a ransom, Caesar is said to have mocked that they were asking too little for a man of his rank. In a sense, he forced them to value his own worth more. This story is more than an anecdote. It shows how Caesar tried to refuse the role of the inferior even in situations of powerlessness. During his imprisonment, he is said to have recited poems and speeches, joked with the pirates, and at the same time announced to them that he would later have them crucified. The pirates apparently thought this was cockiness or a joke. But after the ransom was paid and Caesar was released, he quickly gathered ships, pursued his captors, captured them, and carried out his threat. The process shows a mixture of courage, theatricality, personal insult, and brutal consistency. Caesar could seem charming, but he did not forget humiliation. Those who underestimated him paid for it. At the same time, he publicly demonstrated that he had not only been the victim of a crime, but could make a story of his own determination out of this situation. Back in Rome, Caesar began to expand his career. The courts were an important stage. Young Roman nobles used accusations against powerful men to make themselves known. A successful trial could bring fame, even if it did not always end with a conviction. Caesar stood up against men associated with the Sullan system. In doing so, he positioned himself politically clearly. He presented himself as an opponent of those forces that had profited from violence, expropriation, and intimidation under Sulla. This was risky, because many of these men were still influential, but it corresponded to Caesar's strategy. He did not want to appear as a cautious follower, but as a young man with courage and attitude. If you wanted to stand out in Rome, you had to have opponents. Hostility could be dangerous, but it could also create visibility. Caesar was helped by his connection to the popular camp. He took up the memory of Marius, the great general and rival of Sulla. At a time when the supporters of the Sullan order were still strong, this was a deliberate provocation. This was particularly impressive when Caesar, as quaestor, gave the funeral oration for his aunt Julia, the widow of Marius. Such funeral speeches were more than private mourning in Rome. They were political stagings. The ancestral images of a family were shown, merits were invoked, descent and rank were made publicly visible. Caesar used this opportunity to highlight both the divine origin of the Julians via Venus and the connection to Marius. In doing so, he set an example. He was a patrician, but he did not hide his popular ties. He acknowledged a memory that many conservative senators would have preferred to erase. This became even clearer when Caesar later had pictures of Marius shown in public again, which had been pushed out of public space since Sulla's time. For many ordinary citizens, Marius was still a hero. For Sulla's followers, his memory was a red rag. Caesar understood that the politics of remembrance was power politics. Those who determined which men were honored and which were forgotten also determined which traditions remained alive in Rome. Through such gestures, Caesar gained popularity among those who felt disregarded by the aristocratic elite. He didn't just talk about politics. He served feelings, memories, and loyalties. His office as quaestor took him to Hispania, i.e. to the Iberian Peninsula. There he saw a provincial world that became important for his later rise. Rome was not just the city on the Tiber, but an empire of provinces, armies, administrative districts, local elites, and economic interests. Those who served there could earn money, establish relationships, and gain military experience. In Hispania, Caesar is said to have stood in front of a statue of Alexander the Great and was deeply moved to realize that Alexander had already conquered a world empire at his age, while he himself was still at the beginning. Whether this scene took place exactly as it did is less decisive than its significance. It shows the measure Caesar applied to himself. He did not compare himself to average senators. He thought in terms of world fame. However, this pursuit of greatness was expensive. Caesar spent money to become known, gain supporters, and meet public expectations. In Rome, a political career was hardly possible without spending. You had to finance games, support friends, help clients, litigate, organize election campaigns, and show generosity at every opportunity. Caesar incurred debts on a massive scale. For cautious men, this would have been a sign of danger. For Caesar, it was an investment in the future. He bet that political power and later offices would give him the means to service his debts. This strategy was risky, but not unusual. But Caesar took them particularly far. He lived as if his future success was already assured. Failure could have destroyed him. Success, on the other hand, would turn his creditors into allies, because those who had lent Caesar money had an interest in him becoming powerful. At the same time, Caesar developed a special ability to bind people to himself. He was not only a man of grand gestures, but also of personal attention. He could be generous, remember names, appeal to hopes, recognize talents, and generate loyalty. In Roman politics, such relationships were decisive. Clientele, friendship, mutual commitment, and personal gratitude formed an invisible network of power. Caesar understood that people are ruled not only by fear, but also by expectation. Anyone who believed that they could rise under Caesar became part of his political environment. So his rise was no coincidence. Step by step, he built his public image. He was the young patrician of divine descent. He was the relative of Marius. He was the man who had resisted Sulla. He was the speaker who showed courage in court. He was the prisoner who was not afraid of pirates. He was the politician who risked debt to gain greatness. And he was the ambitious Roman who understood his time not as a peaceful order, but as an arena. Every action served his rank, his visibility, his claim. But there was also a dangerous logic behind all this. Caesar learned that Rome rewarded men who crossed borders. Those who remained cautiously within the old rules may have been respected, but not necessarily feared or loved. On the other hand, those who combined courage, generosity, provocation, and determination could move the masses and challenge the elites. This realization was to shape his entire career. Caesar was not yet the conqueror of Gaul. He did not yet have an army that was personally devoted to him. He was still one aspiring politician among many. But it was already clear that he thought differently from many of his peers. He didn't just want to be part of the Republic. He wanted to become unmistakable in her. At the end of this early phase, there was a man who had turned his origins into political capital and who knew that fame does not wait. It had to be forced. Caesar had learned that words could be weapons, that memory meant power, that debt was both a risk and a tool, that personal boldness created stories, and that Rome admired above all those men who gave the impression of being guided by fate itself. The young Caesar was not yet invincible, but he had already grasped the crucial point. In a republic filled with ambition, fear, and competition, a man had to appear greater than his present. Caesar began to do just that. 4. Debt, games, and political staging. Caesar's further rise in Rome was closely linked to a quality that can seem contradictory to modern observers at first. He was both a highly indebted man and a master of generous self-promotion. In the Roman Republic, political power did not only mean oratory, origin, or military experience. It also meant visibility. Anyone who wanted to be elected had to be remembered by the citizens. Anyone who wanted to be remembered had to make an impression. And if you wanted to make an impression, you needed money. Caesar understood this logic earlier and more radically than many others. He treated money not as a possession to be preserved, but as a tool to be used to gain fame, followers, and political influence. In Rome, generosity was not a private virtue, but a public means of power. Aristocrats expected each other to organize games, facilitate festivals, donate buildings, support their clients, and show at every opportunity that their family benefited the community. For the citizens, such gestures were more than entertainment. They were signs of social relationship. A politician who was generous showed that he had resources and was willing to share them. A politician who seemed stingy appeared weak, narrow-minded, or unworthy. Caesar understood that in a city full of people marked by political crisis, economic insecurity, and social pressure, public generosity had a tremendous emotional impact. It transformed abstract politics into visible experience. The games became particularly important. Gladiator fights, theater performances, animal hunts, and public celebrations were not only pleasures, but also a political stage. They combined religious tradition, mass spectacle, and personal advertising. When a man hosted games, he did not simply act as an organizer. He presented himself as a benefactor of the people. People saw his name, talked about his generosity, and associated entertainment, amazement, and gratitude with his person. Caesar took advantage of this opportunity with extraordinary ambition. As an aedile, i.e., in an office that was responsible for public order, markets, buildings, and games, among other things, he had events organized that went far beyond the ordinary. He didn't just want to appear dutiful. He wanted to impress Rome. These games were expensive, often ruinously expensive. Caesar did not finance it from an inexhaustible family fortune, but through loans. His debts grew enormously. For his opponents, this was a point of attack. They could portray him as an irresponsible spendthrift, a man who lived beyond his means and would one day endanger the Republic simply because he had to satisfy his creditors. But Caesar consciously accepted this risk. He calculated differently than conservative senators, who relied on secure property and cautious career paths. For Caesar, debt was a bet on the future. The greater his debts became, the stronger he had to rise. Failure would have destroyed it, but success would turn the debt into an investment. Every denarius he spent bought not only entertainment, but memory, sympathy, and expectation. Caesar was not a mere spendthrift. His spending followed a strategy. He staged himself as a man of greatness. In Roman society, greatness was closely associated with the term magnificentia, i.e., with public splendor and dignified generosity. Those who gifted Rome with games, buildings, and festivals placed themselves in a tradition of aristocratic benefactors. However, Caesar combined this tradition with a popular message. He didn't just want to show the Senate that he had rank. He wanted to show the people that he was looking for his closeness. His generosity was a language that everyone understood. She said, "I am one of the few great people who see you, give you something, and deserve your support." A particularly effective element of his self-portrayal was dealing with memory. Caesar knew that politics in Rome lived strongly on symbols. Ancestral images, burials, temples, statues, signs of victory, and ancient names were not dead decorations. They had the effect of political messages. Caesar deliberately drew on the memory of Marius, the great general and opponent of Sulla, whose memory had long been suppressed by conservative circles. When Caesar made images and decorations of Marius visible again, it was more than family piety. It was a challenge to the Sullan order and a signal to those Romans who still saw Marius as a national hero. Caesar thus placed himself in a political line that stood for military glory, closeness to the people, and resistance to the harsh rule of the Senate. This was dangerous for his opponents. They saw in Caesar not only an ambitious young man, but someone who reopened old wounds. The memory of Marius and Sulla was not harmless. It was associated with civil war, persecution, blood, and expropriation. Those who honored Marius also reminded us that Sulla's victory was not perceived by everyone as a just restoration of order. Caesar thus played with a politically charged past. But that was precisely his strength. He understood that many people in Rome wanted not only laws, but stories, belonging, and emotional orientation. By publicly rehabilitating Marius, he gave a face to an entire political mood. At the same time, Caesar cultivated the image of the elegant, educated, and generous aristocrat. He was not a simple tribune of the people who only railed against the Senate. He remained a patrician, a man with an old name, a noble mother, good education, and cultivated appearance. This mixture was decisive. If Caesar had only been a radical outsider, he would have been easier to isolate. Had he been just a conservative aristocrat, he would hardly have developed the same appeal to the masses. His art was to combine the two. He was able to embody the claim of old origin and at the same time act as if his future belonged to the people. His outward appearance also became part of this production. Ancient authors report that Caesar paid great attention to his appearance. He dressed carefully, cultivated an elegant style, and stood out for a certain controlled vanity. Opponents occasionally mocked him for this, but they underestimated how much public appearance counted in Rome. Clothing, posture, voice, gestures, and accompaniment could send political messages. A man who visibly stood out from others was remembered. Caesar knew that power does not begin in office. It begins where people associate a name with an image. His image should not be pale. It should make an impression. His connections were also part of this political build-up. Caesar maintained contacts with influential men, but also with lower circles that could be useful to him. In Rome, power consisted of networks. Friends, clients, creditors, relatives, former comrades, and political allies formed a web of mutual expectations. Caesar's debts made him dependent, but they also bound others to him. A creditor who had lent Caesar large sums of money had an interest in Caesar not falling. A supporter who hoped for advantages from Caesar became part of his bet on the future. In this way, Caesar himself transformed financial weakness into political dynamism. In a sense, he forced many people to believe in his success because their own interests were connected with it. Of course, this strategy was dangerous. The higher Caesar climbed, the stronger the resistance grew. Many senators distrusted him. They saw his popularity, his gestures, his debts, and his connection to popular tradition. They wondered if this man would still be acting within the usual rules of the game, or if he would one day be ready to subject the Republic itself to his ambition. This concern was not unfounded, but it did not arise from later events. Even in these years, Caesar showed a willingness to push political norms to their limits. He rarely did anything by chance. Even seemingly generous gestures had a direction. They led to greater notoriety, greater dependence on others, and growing personal authority. But Caesar should not only be seen as a cold calculator. His ambition was deeply linked to the Roman idea of fame. In his world, it was not considered morally reprehensible to strive for greatness. On the contrary, a noble Roman should surpass his ancestors, serve the state, win victories, and make his name immortal. The problem was that the Republic was less and less able to limit such ambitions. It produced men who sought extraordinary fame, but no longer offered them a stable balance. Caesar was therefore the product and accelerator of this system. His debts, his games, and his staging were not merely personal whims. They were an expression of a political culture in which visibility, competition, and public glamour were becoming increasingly important. To the people of Rome, Caesar had to seem like a man who thought bigger than others during those years. While many senators spoke abstractly about order, tradition, and dignity, Caesar gave people spectacle, memory, pride, and the feeling of being part of a special movement. He made politics come alive. Anyone who saw his games, who understood his gestures, who noticed the return of the images of Marius, did not only see a candidate for office. He saw a man who connected the past and the future. At the end of this phase, Caesar was no longer just a talented young aristocrat. He had become a public figure to be talked about, admired, feared, ridiculed, or supported. His debts were enormous, but his political capital had also grown. He had shown that he was willing to risk more than others. He had understood that the Roman Republic functioned not only through laws, but through images, feelings, fame, and expectations. This is exactly how he shaped his rise. Caesar did not simply by popularity. He created a role that fascinated Rome: the generous patrician, the heir of ancient greatness, the friend of the people, and the man who was apparently sure that the future belonged to him. 5. The First Triumvirate. As Caesar became more and more visible in Roman politics, the Republic found itself in a situation in which public office, personal rivalries, and private power interests could hardly be separated from each other. Rome still had its old institutions, its consuls, its tribunes of the people, its senate, and its popular assemblies. But behind this republican facade there were forces at work that had long been greater than the normal political game. Individual men had enormous networks of patronage, veterans, wealth, military fame, or the support of large parts of the population. The old order tried to control these men, but it was often too rigid, too jealous, and too deeply caught up in internal power struggles to truly balance. It was precisely in this atmosphere that an alliance was formed that was not officially a state institution, and yet shook the Republic more than many formal offices: the First Triumvirate. The term triumvirate sounds as if it had been a regulated political body, perhaps a recognized three-man body with clear competences. In reality, it was something else. It was a private power alliance between three men, each possessing something that the others needed. Caesar brought with him political ambition, popularity, determination, and the ability to put pressure on the masses and institutions. Pompey brought military glory, the prestige of a great victor, and the loyalty of many veterans. Crassus brought with him immense wealth, far-reaching business connections, and influence in the Roman financial world. Each of these men was powerful on his own, but each was blocked at the same time. The Senate, especially the conservative optimates, had understood how to thwart their interests again and again. Together they were able to overcome these blockages. Pompey was one of the most famous men in Rome at that time. He had achieved tremendous successes in the East, ended the war against Mithridates, reorganized territories, and extended Rome's influence far into Asia Minor and Syria. His military achievements had given him extraordinary prestige. But when he returned to Italy, he was faced with a problem that was typical of the Republic. A successful general needed political recognition. He wanted his reorganization of the East to be officially confirmed. He also wanted land for his veterans who had served him and whose loyalty formed his power base. For Pompey, this was not just a matter of gratitude. It was a question of his dignity and his authority. If the Senate simply delayed or rejected its regulations, it was calling Pompey into question personally. That is exactly what happened. Many senators distrusted Pompey. They feared his popularity and wanted to prevent a single man from becoming too powerful through military glory. Instead of involving him, they treated him with arrogance and delay. Crassus took precedence over other, but equally important, interests. He was one of the richest men in Rome, perhaps the richest of his time. His fortune was based on real estate transactions, slaves, mines, credit transactions, and an extraordinary ability to turn crises into profits. Politically, he was ambitious, but he lacked the military glamour that Pompey possessed. Although he had played an important role in the suppression of the slave revolt under Spartacus, the fame for it was not as radiant in the public perception as Pompey's victories in the East. Crassus also represented the interests of the tax tenants, those entrepreneurs who collected taxes in the provinces and often took enormous risks in the process. They had apparently miscalculated the tax lease for the province of Asia and demanded financial relief. The Senate was also intransigent here. For Crassus, this meant a political humiliation and a threat to his economic networks. Caesar recognized the opportunity. He himself wanted to reach the consulate, the highest regular office in the Republic. But a consulate alone was not enough for him. He then needed an important command, preferably a province with military capabilities, because only a large command could give him fame, booty, and his own power base. His debts were enormous, his political enemies vigilant, his ambitions enormous. Without strong allies, his path would have remained dangerous. With Pompey and Crassus at his side, he was able to bundle the forces that the Senate had blocked individually. Caesar's special achievement was to bring together two men who actually distrusted each other. Pompey and Crassus were rivals. Both wanted influence, both had big egos, both did not consider the other as a natural partner. Caesar, however, understood that common interests could be stronger than personal dislike. He made himself a mediator between wealth and fame, between monetary power and military prestige. From the outset, the alliance was an attack on the functioning of the Republic, even if it was not formally illegal. Roman politics was based on competition, but also on a certain balance. No single man should dominate everything permanently. Offices were limited in time. Decisions were to be bound by deliberation, coordination, and tradition. The Triumvirate, however, shifted the actual decision-making power from the official institutions to private agreements. What failed in the Senate was to be enforced by common means of power in the People's Assembly. What were individual interests were combined into an overall package. Pompey was to receive his confirmations and veterans' provisions, Crassus his economic relief, Caesar the consulate and later a powerful command. Each gave to the other what he could not achieve alone. Caesar's election as consul for the year 59 BC thus became the decisive lever. A consul had enormous visibility and could drive legislative initiatives. Caesar did not use the office as a reserved administrator, but as a political fighter. Even before he took office, it was clear that his consulate would not be an ordinary year. His opponents tried to oppose him with a colleague who was as weak as possible. Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a conservative optimat, was elected together with Caesar. From the Senate's point of view, Bibulus Caesar should put the brakes on. In practice, it later became more of a symbol of how little the old means could do against Caesar's determination. But before Caesar's consulship took full effect, the triumvirate itself was already an expression of a deeper problem. The Senate had refused to involve powerful men through compromises. Instead, he had blocked, delayed, and humiliated. This attitude arose not only from adherence to principles, but also from fear and class pride. Many optimates believed they were defending the Republic by keeping Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar small. In fact, they drove these men into an alliance far more dangerous than any single demand. The Republic failed here not only because of the ambitions of its strongest men, but also because of the inability of its ruling class to recognize political reality. For Caesar, the alliance was ideal. He now had access to Pompey's prestige and Crassus' money. At the same time, he himself brought the energy and tactical ruthlessness that both others needed. Pompey was great in military glory, but politically often clumsy. Crassus was rich and influential, but not popular enough to inspire the masses. Caesar, on the other hand, could appear, talk, provoke, and drive laws through the political arena. He became the active motor of the alliance. This role increased his rank enormously. He was no longer just an ambitious climber, but the man who had integrated two of the most powerful Romans of his time into a joint project. To strengthen the alliance, Caesar also drew on family connections. His daughter Julia was married to Pompey. In Rome, marriages of the upper class were rarely just private love affairs. They were political bridges, safeguards, and signs of trust. The marriage between Pompey and Julia connected Caesar and Pompey more closely. According to the accounts of antiquity, a personal affection actually developed between Pompey and Julia, which gave the alliance additional stability. For Caesar, however, this connection was above all politically precious. It made Pompey not only an ally, but a son-in-law. In a world where personal relationships had political significance, this was a strong bond. Caesar himself also married politically wisely. After the death of his wife Cornelia and later marital relationships, he did not choose partners independently of power issues. His marriage to Calpurnia, the daughter of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, strengthened his connection to a man who could become politically useful. Such family networks acted like struts in a building of power. They could create trust, order loyalties, and irritate opponents. Caesar understood that politics was decided not only in public speeches, but also in marriages, invitations, commitments, and interdependencies. The First Triumvirate was thus an alliance of interests, fears, and hopes. Pompey hoped for recognition and care for his veterans. Crassus hoped for economic relief and political influence. Caesar hoped for the consulate, a great command and the breakthrough to historic greatness. All three men knew that they needed each other. But all three also knew that this alliance was not based on friendship in the modern sense. It was an alliance of convenience. As long as the common interests were strong enough, it could work. As soon as interests shifted, it could break up. This development was threatening for the Republic because it showed that the official institutions were losing their central role. The Senate could deliberate, Bibulus could protest, conservative speakers could speak of tradition. But when three men with money, fame, clientele, popularity, and political determination worked together, the old inhibitions became weak. The triumvirate was not a coup d'état, but it was a step towards personal power politics. It proved that Rome was no longer governed by offices alone, but by power blocks that emerged outside the constitution. At the same time, Caesar should not be seen as a mere destroyer who had a ready-made plan for autocracy from the beginning. In this phase, he acted like a Roman politician who made maximum use of the available opportunities. He wanted fame, security, and advancement. He saw that the Republic was shaped by men who were strong enough to assert their interests. He did what others did, only more determinedly, more elegantly, and with a greater eye for effect. His particular danger was not that he was a complete stranger to Rome's political culture. It lay in the fact that he understood their rules so well that he could push them to the border and eventually beyond. The First Triumvirate was thus a turning point. It brought together three different forms of power: Caesar's political dynamics, Pompey's military prestige, and Crassus' wealth. It showed the weakness of the Senate, the inability to compromise, and the growing importance of private agreements. For Caesar, it opened the way to the consulate and thus to the next decisive stage of his rise. For Rome, however, it meant that the Republic lost another piece of its old balance. What began as an alliance to enforce personal interests became a mechanism that deformed the political order. Caesar now had the partners he needed. Soon he would show what happened when a man with his ambition held the highest office of the Republic in his hands. 6. Consul Caesar. When Caesar took up the consulship in 59 BC, he reached the highest regular level of the Roman official career. For many men, this would have been the pinnacle of their lives. To be consul for a year meant to be at the head of the Republic, to preside over the sessions of the Senate, to introduce legislation, to shape public decisions, and to permanently inscribe one's name in Rome's political memory. But for Caesar, the consulate was not the goal, but the lever for greater things. He didn't just want to administer this office. He wanted to use it. He wanted to serve his allies, overrun his opponents, secure his own future, and create a command that could bring him military glory, money, and independence. It was clear from the beginning that this consulate would not be a quiet year of republican routine, but an open power struggle over the question of who could really decide in Rome. Caesar's counterpart was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a man from the conservative camp who had been deliberately supported by Caesar's opponents. Bibulus was supposed to limit Caesar's influence and prevent the alliance with Pompey and Crassus from completely dominating politics. The Roman constitution provided for 2 consuls so that no one could act alone. Each could oppose the other politically, and this shared power was a basic principle of the Republic. But Caesar knew how to practically undermine this structure. He acted quickly, with great publicity, and with a determination that repeatedly put Bibulus on the defensive. What was formerly intended as collegiality became a duel in which Caesar dominated the stage and Bibulus increasingly seemed like a powerless disruptor. The most important project at the beginning of his consulate was an agricultural law. It was intended to provide land for Pompey's veterans and at the same time benefit poorer citizens. At first glance, this was a social and military measure. Veterans who had fought for Rome were to be cared for, and landless citizens could be given a new economic basis. Politically, however, this law was far more. It fulfilled a central demand of Pompey, strengthened Caesar's reputation with the people, and forced the Senate to show its colors. Caesar initially introduced the proposal in a form that was intended to appear moderate. He wanted to show that he was not acting arbitrarily, but was presenting a useful law in the interests of the state. But many conservative senators reacted with suspicion. They feared that any distribution of land would strengthen Caesar's popularity and Pompey's clientele. Behind legal objections, therefore, was above all the concern about a shift in power. Caesar cleverly used this blockade. He presented himself as a man who sought a just solution, while the Senate prevented the well-being of the citizens out of class egoism and fear. In doing so, he forced his opponents into an unfavorable role. When they rejected the law, they came across as hard-hearted toward veterans and the poor. If they agreed, they strengthened Caesar and his allies. When the resistance in the Senate continued, Caesar addressed the people's assembly directly. This is exactly where his popular strategy became apparent. He did not accept the Senate as the sole source of political legitimacy. When the aristocratic leadership blocked, he sought the approval of the people. This was legally possible, but politically explosive, because it openly questioned the authority of the Senate. Bibulus tried to stop Caesar. In Rome, religious omens and celestial observations could be used politically. A magistrate could declare that he was observing unfavorable signs that were intended to prevent assemblies or to challenge laws. Bibulus resorted to this means and tried to block Caesar's legislation. But Caesar could not be stopped. There was turmoil during the vote. Bibulus was publicly harassed, his official insignia was damaged, and he finally withdrew largely from active politics. From then on, he declared that he was constantly watching the heavens to make Caesar's actions appear religiously invalid. Caesar, however, continued to rule de facto. Mockingly, it was later said that the year was not the consulate of Caesar and Bibulus, but the consulate of Julius and Caesar. This mockery showed how completely Caesar had politically devalued his counterpart. These events reveal the crisis of the Republic in a concentrated form. On the one hand, Caesar's opponents invoked tradition, religious procedures, and the dignity of the Senate. On the other side stood Caesar with direct popular mobilization, speed, and political pressure. Both sides claimed to defend the Republic. The optimates saw in Caesar a man who bent law and order. Caesar and his followers, on the other hand, could say that a small elite blocked necessary decisions out of self-interest. The truth was not simply on one side. Caesar's methods were ruthless and dangerous, but the Senate's stubborn blockade had contributed to the fact that normal compromises were hardly possible. The institutions no longer functioned as places of balance, but as weapons in a power struggle. In addition to the agricultural law, Caesar ensured the confirmation of Pompey's regulations in the East. After his victories, Pompey had reorganized territories, formed alliances, and created power relations that strengthened Rome's influence in the eastern Mediterranean. The Senate had delayed these regulations for a long time, not because they were fundamentally nonsensical, but because they did not want to grant Pompey even more prestige. Caesar removed this blockade. In doing so, he fulfilled his obligation to Pompey and at the same time proved that the triumvirate worked. Those who joined Caesar got results. Those who relied on the Senate got speeches, delays, and humiliations. This message was very clear to Rome's political class. Crassus was also served. The tax tenants received relief that was important for their economic interests. In doing so, Caesar strengthened the connection to the financial network that Crassus represented. To modern eyes, this may seem like open interest politics, and that's exactly what it was. But in Rome, personal relationships, economic dependencies, and political decisions were closely linked. Caesar understood that a successful alliance did not live on fine words, but on concrete advantages. He delivered. Pompey received his recognition and land for veterans, Crassus received economic relief, and Caesar received support for his next steps. The decisive point of his consulate, however, was to secure a large provincial command at the end of the year in office. A former consul could administer a province as a proconsul. Often this was a way to reduce debt, gain prestige, and gain military experience. Caesar, however, did not want some quiet province in which little fame could be gained. He needed an area with military potential. Initially, he was given command of Gallia Cisalpina and Illyricum by law. Later Gallia Narbonensis was added. This gave him an extraordinarily important command in northern Italy and southern Gaul. The duration was also decisive. Multi-year commandos were dangerous for the republican balance, because they allowed a general to lead troops permanently, build relationships with soldiers, and develop his own military power. For Caesar, this was exactly the opportunity he had been looking for. This command was his salvation and his future at the same time. His debts were enormous. In Rome he had many enemies. After the consulate, he could easily have been legally attacked without protection. A provincial command gave him immunity, distance, and an army. It gave him the opportunity to transform himself into a great general. It is hard to overestimate how important this decision was. Without Gaul, Caesar might have remained an important politician, but not the man who shook the republic. The consulate was the passage. Gaul became the forge of his power. Caesar's policy in 59 BC was accompanied by intense public staging. He had Senate hearings published and made political processes more visible. In doing so, he weakened the traditional control of the senatorial elite over information. If citizens learned how senators discussed and blocked, Caesar could use their reactions politically. Publicity became a means of exerting pressure. Here, too, his modern sense of power was evident. Politics was not only what was decided, but also what people believed about it. Caesar fought for laws, but also for interpretation. He wanted his opponents to appear as backward-looking obstructionists, while he himself appeared as an energetic innovator. At the same time, hatred for him grew. Men like Cato the Younger saw Caesar as a serious threat to the Republic. Cato embodied a stern, morally charged defense of the old order. For him, Caesar was not only a political opponent, but a symptom of decay. Caesar's ruthlessness, his alliances, his debts, his closeness to the people, and his disregard for senatorial authority appeared as warning signs. Cato and other optimates believed that Caesar had to be stopped before he became too powerful. But the harder they fought him, the more Caesar was able to portray himself as the victim of an ossified elite. This cycle of fear, attack, and counterattack further radicalized politics. Caesar's consulate should therefore not be seen as a simple success story. It was successful because he achieved his goals. But it was also destructive because it damaged many republican habits. The joint administration of the consuls was practically undermined. Religious procedures were politically disregarded or instrumentalized. Violence and intimidation accompanied legislation. The Senate was bypassed. The People's Assembly became the weapon of a powerful alliance. Caesar showed how the Republic could be used to concentrate power without formally abolishing it. This was precisely where his political genius and his danger lay. By the end of his year in office, Caesar had achieved almost everything he needed. Pompey was satisfied, Crassus also. The triumvirate had proved its effectiveness, his opponents were humiliated, and his future command was assured. But the price was high. The fronts in Rome had become harder. The optimates did not forgive him for what had happened. Caesar knew that he would be vulnerable at the end of his term if he was not protected by a strong commando. That's why Gaul was not only a career opportunity, but a political shelter. There he was able to build up power outside the immediate reach of his enemies. Caesar's consulate was thus a turning point. It showed a politician who no longer just rose to the top, but actively shaped the Republic according to his will. He combined laws with loyalty to the alliance, popularity with pressure, public staging with personal safeguarding of the future. He still moved within Roman forms, but he filled them with an energy that made their limitations visible. For his followers, he was the man who finally acted. For his opponents, he was the man who transformed the Republic into a personal rule. Both views contained part of the truth. Caesar had proven in 59 BC that he could rule Rome if he found the right levers. Now all he needed was a stage on which he could become bigger than all his rivals. This stage was located in the north, beyond the Alps, in Gaul. 7. The road to Gaul. When Caesar left Rome after his consulate and took over his command in the northern provinces, the period of his life began that was to finally lift him out of the ranks of ambitious politicians and catapult him into the rank of an exceptional historical figure. Gaul was not simply an administrative region for Caesar. It was an opportunity, a shelter, a stage and a risk at the same time. In Rome he had made powerful enemies. His consulate had humiliated his opponents, challenged the Senate, and further polarized the political order. As long as he held an office and had a large command, he was protected. But as soon as he returned to Rome as a simple private citizen, there was the threat of accusations, political revenge, and perhaps complete collapse. Caesar knew that his future did not lie in careful administration. He needed fame, money, soldiers, and victories. Gaul offered all this. The area that the Romans called Gaul was not a unified nation in the modern sense. It consisted of many tribes, principalities, tribal alliances, and regional power groups that pursued their own interests, competed with each other, formed alliances, and broke up again. The Gallic world was culturally diverse, politically flexible, and militarily serious. The Romans differentiated between the already Roman-influenced province in the south, which was later often referred to as Gallia Narbonensis, and the Great Free Gaul north of it. This southern province was particularly important for Rome because it secured the land connection between Italy and Spain. Roads, trade, Roman settlements, and strategic interests made it a sensitive border area. Anyone who allowed unrest there endangered not only a province, but also the connection of two important spheres of power of the Roman Empire. For many Romans, Gaul was at the same time a place of fear and remembrance. The Gallic tribes had a special place in the Roman imagination because the Gauls had once threatened Rome itself and even plundered the city in the early 4th century BC. Even though this event happened a long time ago, it remained deep in the collective memory. Gauls were considered brave, wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. This idea was often shaped by prejudice, but politically useful. A general who fought against Gauls could present himself as a defender of Italy. Caesar was later to use this fear masterfully. His wars thus appeared not only as personal conquests, but as necessary measures for the security of Rome. His original command included Gallia Cisalpina, i.e. the area on this side of the Alps in northern Italy, plus Illyricum on the eastern Adriatic coast. Later, the southern Gallic province beyond the Alps was added. This combination was exceptionally valuable. Gallia Cisalpina was close to Italy and offered Caesar direct access to Roman politics. From there, he was able to stay in touch with his followers in Rome, observe developments, and exert influence. At the same time, he was far enough away to have his own military room for maneuver. The southern province in Gaul opened the way for him to enter a vast area full of conflicts in which Rome could intervene. Illyricum, on the other hand, offered the possibility of further campaigns in the east of the Adriatic. Caesar had thus not only received a province, but a strategic space with several possible directions. There were several reasons why Caesar needed a military command. First of all, there was his personal ambition. In Rome, military glory counted more than almost anything else. Orators could be admired, lawgivers respected, and rich men feared, but the victorious general was above them. Triumphal processions, booty, soldier loyalty, and the reputation of invincible energy gave a politician an authority that no Senate resolution could replace. Pompey had gained his extraordinary position precisely because of this. Caesar knew that he could only become Pompey's equal in the long run if he himself won great victories. Without military achievement, he would have remained dependent on the fame of his son-in-law and ally. With his own victories, he could become a power that no one could ignore. Secondly, Caesar needed money. His political career had been bought with enormous debts. Public games, election campaigns, generous gifts, clientele and political alliances had devoured sums that could hardly be compensated for by normal income. A provincial command could bring in income, legally and less legally. Even more important were the spoils of war, tributes, slaves, and the distribution of resources. In the Roman world, conquest and enrichment were closely linked. This was true not only for the general, but also for his soldiers and supporters. A successful war could pay off debts, buy new followers, and consolidate one's own position. Caesar therefore needed victories not only for his honor, but for his financial and political existence. Third, he needed soldiers. The Roman Republic had changed. Armies were no longer bound only to the abstract state, but developed personal ties to their commanders. A commander who successfully led his men, paid them well, made booty possible, shared their hardships, and secured their future, could gain loyalty far beyond normal duty. At the beginning of his command, Caesar did not yet have that almost legendary connection to his legions that would later become famous. But Gaul gave him the opportunity to build it up. In long campaigns, under danger, in hunger, cold, marches and battles, a relationship between general and army developed that was later to become decisive for the entire republic. The immediate cause of Caesar's intervention in Gaul was the movement of the Helvetians. This tribal association from the area of today's Switzerland planned to leave its homeland and move further west. For Caesar, this was the opportunity he needed. He portrayed the migration as a danger to the Roman province and to allied Gallic groups. Whether the Helvetians actually posed a direct threat to Rome or whether Caesar deliberately exaggerated the danger is an important question. Real uncertainties were probably combined with Caesar's desire for a military prelude. A large population movement near the border was never harmless for Rome. At the same time, it was an ideal occasion for an ambitious proconsul to become active. Caesar acted quickly. Speed became one of his most important characteristics. He did not wait until political debates in Rome limited his options. He presented himself as a man who recognized dangers and reacted immediately. This speed had military and propaganda significance. Militarily, it was able to surprise opponents and secure initiative. Politically, she made Caesar appear as a determined protector. Those who acted quickly seemed necessary. Anyone who contradicted only later seemed petty or out of touch with reality. It was precisely this pattern that was to run through his Gallic campaigns. Caesar created facts and then explained them in such a way that they seemed like inevitable responses to external threats. We know his account of the events mainly from his own commentariae on the Gallic War. This work is one of the most important sources for these years, but at the same time a masterpiece of political self-expression. Caesar writes in a seemingly sober style, in the third person, with clear language and military objectivity. This is precisely why his portrayal seems credible and controlled. But she is pursuing a goal. Caesar wanted to show readers in Rome that his wars were just, necessary, and successful. He did not present himself as an aggressor who subjugated foreign countries out of personal ambition, but as a responsible Roman general who protected allies, averted dangers, and brought order to an unsafe region. This combination of warfare and interpretation was a central part of his power. Gaul was therefore not only a geographical area, but a political instrument. Every campaign could have an effect in Rome. Each victory strengthened Caesar's reputation. Every booty eased his financial situation. Each new soldier who served under him could later become part of his personal power base. At the same time, Caesar was not allowed to lose his connection to the capital. While he fought in the north, Rome remained a political battlefield. His opponents watched him, his allies needed him, his future depended on him translating military successes into political strength. Caesar therefore had to fight two wars, the visible war in Gaul and the invisible power struggle in Rome. Caesar's appearance also meant a new quality of Roman interference for the Gallic tribes. Rome already had alliances, trade relations, and military interests in the region. But Caesar went further. He took advantage of conflicts between tribes, supported some groups against others, acted as an arbitrator, and turned local disputes into Roman affairs. This was a classic strategy of imperial power. An empire does not always have to conquer everything openly right away. First of all, it can mediate, protect, punish, reward, and create dependencies. Caesar was extremely skilled at this. He understood that Gaul could not be ruled by a single blow. It had to be politically divided, militarily defeated, and psychologically impressed. The road to Gaul was therefore also Caesar's path to a new form of personal power. In Rome he was a consular, an important politician with dangerous enemies. In Gaul he could become the undisputed commander. There he decided on routes, alliances, punishments, sieges, and battles. There he was able to show his ability to lead without having to bow to the rituals of the Senate every day. This freedom changed him and his position. The longer he commanded, the less he was just an official of the Republic. It became the center of its own sphere of power. But in the beginning, nothing was certain. Gaul was able to exalt Caesar, but also to destroy it. A lost campaign would have destroyed his reputation, strengthened his enemies, and made his debt burden unbearable. The Gallic tribes were by no means weak. They could field large contingents of warriors, knew their terrain, had strong cavalry, and were politically more mobile than Roman prejudices suggested. Caesar had to succeed because failure was hardly an option for him. It was precisely this pressure that made him dangerous. He took risks because his entire future was at stake. Thus, Caesar's Gallic chapter began with a mixture of strategic opportunity, personal necessity, and imperial logic. He didn't just move north because Rome had sent him there. He went to Gaul because there was everything he needed: enemies he could defeat, dangers he could represent, riches he could gain, soldiers he could bind to himself, and glory that could raise him above Pompey and all other rivals. The road to Gaul was the path from Roman politics to historical greatness. But it was also the path to a spiral of violence that would affect hundreds of thousands of people and in the end would not stabilize the Republic, but would continue to shake it. Caesar left Rome as an ambitious proconsul. He would return from Gaul as a man who could no longer be easily integrated into the old order. 8. The Gallic War begins. When Caesar took command of Gaul, it was not yet foreseeable that it would lead to one of the most momentous wars of conquest in Roman history. For Rome, Gaul was a space full of possibilities, but also full of uncertainties. For Caesar, it was the stage on which he had to prove that he was more than a brilliant politician from Rome. He needed victories, and quickly. His enemies in the capital were waiting for mistakes. His debts weighed heavily. His alliance with Pompey and Crassus gave him support, but no lasting protection when he failed militarily. Gaul had to bring him fame, otherwise it could become his political grave. The first major reason for Caesar's intervention was the migration of the Helvetians. This people lived in the territory of present-day Switzerland and planned to leave their homeland to move further west. In Caesar's account, this departure appears as a dangerous movement of a large warlike mass that threatened the Roman province and allied tribes. He described the Helvetians as ambitious, ready to fight, and restless, as people who pushed out of their narrow settlement areas and were able to shake the balance of Gaul in the process. In fact, such a hike was not without risk for Rome. Large population movements could destabilize borders, change alliances, and endanger Roman interests. But Caesar also realized that this situation offered him a perfect start. He could act before he was accused of inaction in Rome, and he could present his first campaign as a defensive measure. The Helvetians asked to be allowed to pass through the Roman province. Caesar did not immediately deny them this, but gained time. While he was negotiating, he had fortifications built, troops gathered, and the crossings secured. Even here, one of his typical strengths became apparent. He combined diplomacy with military preparation. He spoke, listened, and promised exams, but in the background he created facts. When the Helvetians finally did not get the desired draft, They looked for other ways. Caesar followed them. He portrayed their march as a threat to Roman friends and turned a migratory movement into a war in which he could act as the protector of order. The battles against the Helvetians showed how Caesar understood war. It wasn't just about being brave on the battlefield. The decisive factors were speed, supply, news, alliances, and psychological impact. The Roman legions were excellently organized, but they had to be guided, fed, and brought to the right place in time. Caesar marched fast, exploiting the opponent's weaknesses and attacking when opportunities presented themselves. At Bibracte, the decisive battle took place. The Helvetians fought hard and with great perseverance. Caesar did not portray them as cowardly opponents, for a weak enemy would have diminished his own fame. It was precisely because they were brave that his victory became greater. In the end, the Helvetians were defeated and forced to return to their homeland. Caesar explained this as a necessary measure for the security of Gaul and the Roman province. At the same time, he had achieved what he needed politically, his first major success. But no sooner had this campaign ended than the next conflict opened up. Gallic envoys turned to Caesar and asked for help against Ariovistus, the leader of Germanic warriors, who had entrenched himself west of the Rhine. Ariovistus was not an insignificant robber captain, but a powerful warlord who had been drawn into Gallic power struggles. Some Gallic groups had initially summoned him themselves to gain support against rivals. But as so often in history, a useful ally became a threat. Ariovistus and his men gained land, influence, and power. For many Gauls, their presence became unbearable. For Caesar, this was another opportunity. He was able to present himself as the protector of Gaul and at the same time conjure up a greater danger, the Germanic tribes. The idea of Germanic peoples on the other side of the Rhine had a special effect on the Romans. It was associated with fear of fierce warriors, uncontrollable movements, and threats from the north. Caesar consciously used this fear. If Ariovistus appeared to be a danger to Gaul and indirectly to Rome, then Caesar's intervention was not an attack, but a precaution. He conducted negotiations with Ariovistus, but these failed. Both men stood for completely different claims to power. Ariovistus saw himself as a ruler through victory and the right of the strongest. Caesar saw himself as a representative of Rome and as an arbiter of the order of Gaul. A coexistence was hardly possible, because both claimed authority over the same space. The campaign against Ariovistus was also a test for Caesar's own soldiers. The Germanic tribes were considered fearsome, and unrest spread in the Roman ranks. Some officers and soldiers feared the impending battle. Caesar responded with a speech that showed his leadership. He portrayed the fear as unworthy, reminded of Roman discipline, and declared that if necessary he would only march with the 10th Legion if the others did not want to follow. These words were wisely chosen. They put the hesitants to shame and at the same time honored the 10th Legion, which thus became a special formation of trust. Caesar understood how to not only command soldiers, but how to bind them emotionally. He made them feel part of a special community whose honor was at stake. In the ensuing battle, Caesar defeated Ariovistus and drove his forces back across the Rhine. This victory was of enormous importance. Caesar had now defeated not only a Gallic tribal association, but also a Germanic warlord. For Rome, this could be presented as a defense against a greater northern threat. For Gaul, it meant that Caesar was no longer just a temporary Roman commander. He became a power that could decide the fate of entire peoples. Anyone who sought his help had to accept his supremacy. Anyone who resisted him risked annihilation. This began a pattern that was to characterize the entire Gallic War. Caesar used local conflicts to expand his role. One tribe asked for help, another was portrayed as a danger, a migration appeared as a threat, a Germanic leader as a harbinger of an invasion. Each individual step could be explained in itself as a reaction to a concrete situation. But taken together, there was a steady expansion of Roman power. Caesar did not simply set out with the declared goal of conquering all of Gaul. Rather, he turned every crisis into a new reason for intervention. every intervention into new dependence, and every victory into a greater obligation to continue. His legions learned a lot about their general in these first campaigns. Caesar was fast, demanding, and personally present. He shared hardships, made decisions under pressure, and was visible in dangerous moments. For Roman soldiers, this was decisive. A general who commanded only from a safe distance could gain respect, but rarely passionate loyalty. Caesar, on the other hand, appeared as a man who knew his soldiers, publicly praised their achievements, and at the same time demanded great effort from them. The connection between Caesar and his army did not come about in a single moment. It grew out of marches, camps, battles, sieges, and dangers overcome together. At the same time, Caesar was already writing his own legend. His reports on the Gallic War presented the events in a clear, orderly, and seemingly factual manner. He wrote of himself in the third person, as if he were a sober observer of his own actions. It was precisely this distance that generated authority. The reader in Rome should not have the feeling that he is reading a boastful self-portrayal, but a reliable report on necessary military measures. But behind this simplicity lay political art. Caesar chose what he emphasized, how he described opponents, what motives he explained, and what doubts he concealed. His victories were not only achieved on the field, but also in the narrative. The first years of the war made Caesar more visible than ever in Rome. News of successes spread, friends used them politically, opponents had to watch his fame grow. Each victory made it more difficult to dismiss him as a mere troublemaker or a debt-ridden ambition. He now became a successful general. This is exactly what changed the balance of power. Pompey had long possessed the greatest military fame, but Caesar began to build up a legend of his own. Pompey was still the older and more famous victor, but Caesar caught up. For the people of Gaul, these first campaigns marked the beginning of a period of growing uncertainty. Some elites initially saw Caesar as a useful ally, others as a danger. Some hoped to defeat their rivals with Roman help. Others realized too late that Roman help was rarely free. Caesar brought not only protection, but dependence. He brought order, but an order according to Roman interests. He ended conflicts, but often in such a way that Rome ended up being stronger and the Gallic tribes weaker. The beginning of the Gallic War was therefore more than a series of military operations. It was the beginning of a political transformation. Caesar transformed himself from an ambitious consular into a conqueror. Gaul was transformed from an area of Roman influence into a future area of conquest. The legions were transformed from republican troops into an army that was increasingly connected to Caesar's person. And Rome saw from afar a man growing who collected victories, defeated enemies, and created a power base that would one day no longer be easy to control. Caesar had begun in Gaul what he had prepared in Rome, the rise through risk, speed, and staging. His first victories gave him what he needed: credibility as a general, booty for his men, material for his reports, and political glamour for his supporters. But they also opened a door that could no longer be closed. Anyone who had once begun to order Gaul with Roman legions had to intervene deeper and deeper. Protection turned into rule. Rule turned into resistance. And resistance turned into a war that made Caesar famous, devastated Gaul, and brought the Roman Republic further to the brink of its own end. 9. Caesar as a master of warfare. Caesar's fame in Gaul did not come from the fact that he won battles alone. Many Roman generals had won victories, conquered cities, and celebrated triumphal processions. What made Caesar special, however, was the way he waged war. He combined speed, discipline, political calculation, psychological effect, and personal closeness to his soldiers into a form of warfare that often overwhelmed his opponents. He was not a general who relied only on brute force. He thought in terms of movements, in terms of time advantages, in messages, in covenants, and in the effect of every decision on Rome. For Caesar, a campaign was never just a military operation. It has always been a political signal. One of his greatest strengths was his speed. Again and again, Caesar surprised opponents by showing up earlier than they thought possible. Roman legions were famous for their marching discipline anyway, but Caesar took this ability to the extreme. He had his men cover long distances, cross rivers, master difficult terrain, and build fortified camps in a short time. This speed was not only a sign of military capability. It created fear. A Gallic tribe, believing that they still had time for consultations, alliances, or retreat, could suddenly learn that Caesar was already nearby. In doing so, he deprived his opponents of the most important advantage that politically fragmented groups needed: time to vote. Especially in Gaul, time was a decisive factor. The Gallic tribes were brave, wealthy, and by no means insignificant militarily, but they rarely acted permanently as a unit. Many decisions had to be negotiated in tribal assemblies, among princes, nobles, and followers. Old rivalries, personal jealousy, and regional interests made joint action difficult. Caesar understood this weakness very well. He often attacked before his opponents could fully unite. He supported some groups against others, took hostages, confirmed local leaders, put pressure on rivals, and thus forced Gallic politics into a Roman order. So his warfare did not begin on the battlefield. It began in negotiations, threats, gifts, and the deliberate use of internal divisions. Another foundation of his strength was Roman camp discipline. For the legions, the fortified marching camp was a daily instrument of security. Where other armies camped exhausted after a march, Roman soldiers built ditches, ramparts, gates, and orderly camp roads. This system gave Caesar enormous operational freedom. Even deep in enemy territory, he was able to protect his troops at night, organize supplies, and create a fixed starting point for further movements. For Gallic opponents, this had to be impressive and frustrating at the same time. The Romans turned almost every place they stopped into a small military fortress. This made them difficult to surprise and allowed them to survive even in uncertain territory. Caesar also knew that care was often more important than bravery. An army could only fight if it had food, animals were cared for, weapons were maintained, and supply routes worked. Gaul was large, but not easy to control everywhere. Seasons, crops, rivers, forests, and destroyed supplies could put a Roman army in serious trouble. Caesar therefore paid close attention to grain deliveries, allies, and supply stores. When tribes delayed or refused promised deliveries, it was not only a logistical problem, but a political sign of disobedience. Caesar often reacted harshly to this, because for him supply meant domination at the same time. Those who supplied Caesar's army recognized his power. Those who did not question it. His military superiority was also based on the structure of the legions. The Roman army was extremely flexible in its organization. The legionnaires were heavily armed, well-trained, and used to fighting in orderly formations. They could throw, push, build, march, and besiege. A Roman soldier was not only a fighter, but also a worker, engineer, and part of a strict chain of command. Caesar made masterful use of this versatility. He had bridges built, siege works erected, camps fortified, and marching routes secured. His legions were able to develop a power for military energy and technical work against which many opponents could hardly find suitable answers. This was particularly evident during sieges. Caesar understood that cities, fortified heights, and refuges were not taken by courage alone. You needed planning, machines, ramparts, towers, ramps, ditches, and patience. The Roman art of siege was a symbol of imperial endurance. Where an opponent sought shelter behind walls, Rome responded with work. Day after day, plants were advanced, rooms were enclosed, failures were averted, and the pressure increased. For the defense attorneys, this was psychologically grueling. They saw the Roman machine approaching slowly but inexorably. Caesar used this effect deliberately. Siege was not just technology. It was a demonstration of Roman determination. But Caesar was not infallible. His audacity got him into dangerous situations several times. Precisely because he acted quickly and took risks, he could find himself in situations where defeat was possible. The difference was that Caesar often reacted exceptionally calmly and decisively in crises. When his lines were threatened, he personally appeared at critical points. When soldiers staggered, he showed himself visibly. When a retreat was necessary, he tried to make it orderly. In his reports, he almost always appears as the master of the situation. This portrayal is of course part of his self-portrayal, but even his successes show that he actually had a rare ability to recognize dangerous moments and act quickly. His relationship with the soldiers was a decisive factor. Caesar demanded a lot, but he also gave recognition. He addressed his men not only as an anonymous mass, but understood their honor, their expectations, and their needs. The 10th Legion in particular enjoyed his trust and was repeatedly emphasized by him. Such awards have a strong effect. A soldier whose unit was specially honored by the general fought not only for pay and booty, but for the reputation of his legion. Caesar understood that military morality comes from pride. He created a relationship in which his men believed they were serving under an extraordinary general and were themselves part of an extraordinary story. Loot played an important role in this. Soldiers expected a reward. In the Roman world, war was also a form of economic hope. Successful campaigns could bring money, slaves, equipment, and later land allotments. Caesar therefore not only had to inspire his men, but also satisfy them materially. His victories in Gaul made loot possible and increased the expectation that loyalty to Caesar would pay off. This created a personal bond that became dangerous for the Republic. The longer the legions fought under Caesar, the more they connected their future with him and not only with a distant Senate in Rome. Caesar's dealings with opponents fluctuated between mildness and brutal harshness. This mixture was no coincidence. Mildness could be useful if it facilitated submission. Those who surrendered in time could hope to be spared. As a result, Caesar presented himself as a reasonable victor, not just a destroyer. Harshness, on the other hand, set an example. If a tribe rebelled, attacked Roman envoys, or broke agreements, Caesar could punish cruelly. Such penalties should not only affect those affected, but also deter others. The message was clear: submission could bring security, resistance could bring destruction. This policy was effective, but morally dismal. It shows that Caesar's warfare consisted not only of brilliant strategy, but also of intimidation, coercion, and violence against entire communities. An important element of his art of war was the psychological interpretation of the enemy. Caesar often portrayed Gallic and Germanic opponents in his writings in such a way that his own decisions seemed necessary. Gauls were portrayed as courageous but changeable, Germans as particularly wild and dangerous, individual leaders as ambitious or unfaithful. This created an image in which Rome brought order and Caesar appeared as the rational ruler of a chaotic space. But this presentation must be viewed critically. The Gallic tribes did not act simply out of unrest or disloyalty. They defended interests, freedom, rank, and survival. Many of their decisions were reactions to Roman pressure. Caesar described their motives in such a way that his own role remained justified. His ability to control information was also remarkable. Caesar needed scouts, spies, defectors, allied princes, and swift messengers. Those who knew more quickly where the enemy stood, which tribes were wavering, and where supplies were located could direct the war. In a world without modern communication, information was a precious commodity. Caesar built a web of news and relationships. At the same time, he made sure that his own version of events reached Rome. His commentarii were not private memoirs, but political reports for an audience that could have a say in his fame and future. While Caesar fought in Gaul, his narrative continued to fight in Rome. His warfare was also closely linked to diplomacy. He could declare tribes allies, make enemies of others, demand hostages, support or depose kings, and change local power relations. This policy was often as important as a battle. A Gallic nobleman, who gained influence through Caesar, became dependent on Roman support. A tribe seeking Caesar's protection opened up access to internal Gallic affairs in Rome. In this way, Gaul was gradually drawn into a system of Roman control. War and diplomacy were not mutually exclusive for Caesar. They were two sides of the same strategy. Despite all these abilities, the Gallic War remained a brutal war of conquest. Caesar's mastery must not be romanticized. His genius also consisted in efficiently organizing violence and justifying it politically. His victories meant death, enslavement, expulsion, and loss of political freedom for many people. The glory that Rome celebrated was often experienced as a catastrophe in Gaul. This is precisely why Caesar is so difficult to judge as a general. Militarily, he was extraordinary. Politically, he was brilliant. Humanly and morally, however, his greatness led over the suffering of countless people. For Rome, however, the fascination grew with each campaign. Caesar appeared as a man who conquered everywhere, who crossed rivers, subjugated tribes, pushed back Germanic tribes, and retained control even in the greatest danger. His name was associated with movement, success, and determination. While his opponents in Rome were arguing about procedures, offices, and tradition, Caesar created facts in a huge theater of war. He became the epitome of the acting man. It was precisely this that made him more and more politically dangerous. At the end of this development, there was a general whose power no longer came from just one office. It came from experience, booty, soldier loyalty, fame, fear, and narrative. Caesar had learned in Gaul how to dominate large spaces, intimidate people, bind allies, and turn victories into political authority. His mastery of warfare was therefore not only a military talent. It was a comprehensive instrument of power. Every march, every siege, every speech to the soldiers, and every report to Rome made it greater. Gaul became the school of his rule. And the more successful he became there, the more difficult the question became whether a man with such power could ever simply return to the Republic as a normal citizen. 10. Vercingetorix and the Great Gallic Revolt. The Gallic War had brought Caesar fame, booty, and a steadily growing power base. But the deeper Rome penetrated into the internal affairs of Gaul, the stronger the resistance grew. Many Gallic tribes had initially believed that they could use Caesar as an ally. Some hoped to weaken old rivals, strengthen their own princes, or gain protection from Germanic warrior groups through Roman support. But with each passing year, it became clearer that Caesar's help came at a high price. Rome did not come as a temporary arbiter, but as a ruling power. Alliances became dependencies, protection became control, Roman decisions became a claim to obedience. For the Gallic elites, this meant an ever greater restriction of their freedom. For many communities, it meant tributes, hostages, Roman interventions, and the constant threat of military force. The resistance to Caesar, therefore, did not arise for a single reason. It was the result of exhaustion, insult, fear, and political insight. The Gallic tribes had experienced that Caesar could reward quickly, but punish just as quickly. They had seen entire groups subjugated, hostages taken, cities attacked, and leaders deposed. The Roman general was no longer just a powerful stranger in the south. He had become a force that could influence political decisions throughout Gaul. This is precisely what made his rule unbearable for many. As long as the tribes acted individually, Caesar could defeat them one after the other. As long as old rivalries remained stronger than the common interest, Rome remained superior. The crucial question, therefore, was whether Gaul would be able to overcome its internal fragmentation, at least for a short time. In this situation, Vercingetorix, a young nobleman from the tribe of the Arverni, came forward. His name became a symbol of the Gallic resistance, although he should not simply be understood as a modern hero of freedom. He was a man of his time, characterized by aristocratic competition, tribal politics, and personal ambition. But he recognized better than many others that Caesar could only be seriously challenged if the Gauls joined forces and no longer allowed Rome to play them off against each other. His strength lay not only in bravery, but in political insight. He understood that the war against Caesar could not be waged as a series of individual tribal uprisings. It had to become a joint war. The revolt began in a situation where Caesar himself seemed vulnerable. The Roman troops were spread over various winter camps, and Caesar was temporarily south of the Alps. For the Gauls, this offered the hope of separating the Roman units from each other and achieving local success before Caesar could gather his full strength. The spark of the uprising quickly jumped over. In particular, the attack on Roman traders and citizens in Cenabum showed that the rebellion was not only directed against individual measures, but against the Roman presence as a whole. Such violence was a signal to Caesar that it was no longer a matter of limited disobedience. It was about a broad survey. Vercingetorix initially had to fight for recognition within his own tribe. Not all Arverni wanted to risk an open war against Rome immediately. Older and more cautious forces feared Caesar's retribution. But Vercingetorix prevailed and gathered followers by combining determination, charisma, and clear strategy. He did not allow himself to be limited to the role of a local rebel, but aspired to lead a larger alliance. His authority was based on the hope that he could be the man who would finally force Gaul to act together. This hope was enormous, but also fragile. Gallic unity was never a matter of course. It had to be rebuilt again and again, against old enmities, against mistrust, and against the temptation of individual tribes to come to terms with Rome. Caesar reacted with the speed that made him so dangerous. Despite the difficult situation, he managed to bring his troops together and regain the initiative. He knew that an uprising of this size could not be fought militarily alone. He had to show that Rome was still capable of acting. Any impression of Roman weakness would have encouraged other tribes to rebel. Caesar's first task was therefore psychological. He had to renew fear of Roman retaliation and at the same time prove to his own soldiers that the situation remained manageable. In such moments, his ability to turn crisis into movement became apparent. He did not wait until the opponents were fully organized, but sought the pressure. Vercingetorix, on the other hand, recognized that open field battles against the legions were dangerous. The Roman infantry was disciplined, experienced, and difficult to defeat in orderly battle. Therefore, he relied on a strategy that was to meet Caesar's greatest strength: supply. He had supplies destroyed, settlements evacuated, and tried to make it more difficult for the Romans to access food. This scorched earth was painful for the Gallic population, but it made military sense. If Caesar was deep in the country with his legions and could not find supplies, even his discipline could be endangered. Here it became clear that Vercingetorix was not just a courageous warrior. He thought strategically. He understood that you didn't always have to defeat a Roman army directly. You could try to starve them, tire them out, and drive them into unfavorable situations. But this strategy demanded sacrifices, and victims create resistance. Many Gallic communities had to give up their own supplies, villages, or cities so that they did not fall into Caesar's hands. Not everyone was willing to do so. The city of Avaricum in particular, for example, was known for the difficulties of Gallic warfare. The residents and allies asked not to destroy the city. They trusted in their fortifications and their location. Vercingetorix gave in, although he knew well that this was a risk. Caesar besieged Avaricum and took the city after a hard siege. The subsequent killing of many residents once again showed the brutality of the war. For Caesar, Avaricum was a success that strengthened supplies and morale. For the Gauls, it was a bloody lesson that Roman siege art and consistency could have terrible consequences. Despite such setbacks, the uprising remained alive. Vercingetorix's authority grew precisely because he did not wage the war lightly. At Gergovia, he finally achieved a significant success. The city was located in terrain that was difficult to access, and Caesar could not fully exploit his usual superiority. In the battles for Gergovia, the Romans suffered a severe defeat. For Caesar, this was dangerous, because his reputation was based on the impression of constant control. A defeat could have political consequences in Rome and reignite Gallic hopes. For Vercingetorix, on the other hand, Gergovia was proof that Caesar was vulnerable. The victory strengthened the revolt and showed that the Roman legions were not invincible. But the success also had a dangerous effect. He could create exuberance. Vercingetorix remained cautious, but many Gallic warriors now wanted to confront the Romans more directly. As a result, there were movements and decisions that gave Caesar opportunities again. Finally, Vercingetorix withdrew with his troops to Alesia, a strongly situated fortress. It was there that the most famous siege of the Gallic War took place and one of the most impressive examples of Roman military technology. Alesia was a decision point for both sides. Vercingetorix hoped to be able to hold on to the fortress while a Gallic relief army was assembled. Caesar recognized the danger immediately. If he besieged the city and at the same time a large army came towards him from outside, he could be trapped between two enemies. His answer was a masterpiece of Roman engineering and military discipline. He had huge fortification lines built. One line was directed inwards against the encircled troops in Alesia, a second outwards against the expected relief army. The Romans built ditches, ramparts, palisades, towers, traps, and barriers. They turned the landscape around Alesia into an artificial war machine. This construction achievement was not only technically impressive, but psychologically devastating. The trapped people saw the ring close around them. The relief army later saw that it did not simply have to attack a besieging army, but a deeply staggered system of fortifications. Caesar was indeed in an extremely dangerous situation. If the coordination of the Gauls had been better, or if the Roman lines had broken at a crucial point, the entire war could have tipped over. But Caesar held his troops together. He moved reserves, recognized critical points, and appeared in person where the danger was greatest. Such moments shaped his myth. The general was not only the planner, but the visible center of the decision. The battles for Alesia were fierce. The Gauls attacked from the outside, while the trapped attempted strikes. For a moment, the Roman situation seemed to be dangerously tottering. But the discipline of the legions, the strength of the fortifications, and Caesar's leadership held firm. In the end, the relief failed. For Vercingetorix, the situation was hopeless. Hunger, exhaustion, and a lack of hope forced them to give up. The famous scene of his capitulation, in which he surrenders to Caesar, later became an image of great symbolic power. The Gallic leader, defeated but not forgotten, before the Roman victor at the height of his glory. With Alesia, the Gallic resistance was not immediately completely ended, but its central power was broken. Vercingetorix was captured and later paraded in Rome in Caesar's triumphal procession before he was executed. His fate shows the harshness of Roman power. A man who had embodied hope for many Gauls became proof of victory for Caesar. The triumph of one meant the humiliation of the other. For Rome, Alesia was a sign of greatness. For Gaul, it was a turning point in the loss of political independence. The significance of Vercingetorix lies in the fact that he forced Caesar to go to the limit of his abilities. He was not just any adversary, but the first to concentrate the Gallic resistance on a larger scale and develop a strategy that seriously threatened Caesar's strengths. Precisely for this reason, Caesar's victory over him made the Roman general even greater. A great victor needs a great opponent, and Vercingetorix became exactly that opponent in Caesar's history. But behind the dramaturgy of hero and antagonist, there is a bitter reality. The war had devastated Gaul, killed or enslaved countless people, and permanently subjected an entire region to Roman rule. Caesar won more than one battle in Alesia. He won a legend. His soldiers saw that their commander could win even in the greatest danger. The people in Rome heard of a success that seemed almost superhuman. His opponents had to realize that Caesar now had fame that could compete with that of Pompey. Gaul had given him what he had been looking for: military immortality, wealth, loyal legions, and the knowledge that he had accomplished extraordinary things. But this victory did not solve the crisis of the Republic. On the contrary, he intensified it. A man who had subjugated all of Gaul could not simply return to Rome like an ordinary official and surrender himself to his enemies. The greater Caesar's fame became, the greater the fear of his opponents. Vercingetorix was defeated, but Caesar's most dangerous battle lay ahead of him. After Alesia, It was clear that the man who had conquered Gaul could no longer be made small in Rome without the entire republic being caught in a new storm. 11. Glory, fear, and the collapse of the alliance. After the victory at Alesia, Caesar was at the height of his military glory. The Gallic resistance had not yet been completely broken in every corner, but the decisive force had been defeated. Vercingetorix was trapped, the great hopes for a joint Gallic uprising were dashed, and Rome no longer saw Caesar as the ambitious politician who had once attracted attention with debts, games, and daring alliances. He had become a conqueror. He had brought a vast territory under Roman control, led legions through the most difficult campaigns, defeated dangerous opponents, and made a name for himself that could compete with the fame of Pompey. But this was precisely where the new danger lay. Caesar's success did not make him safer, but more threatening. The greater his fame became, the greater the fear of those men in Rome who believed they had to protect the Republic from him. The alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had once opened the way for Caesar to the consulate and then to Gaul. It had been an alliance of convenience, not an alliance of genuine political harmony. Each of the three men had pursued his own interests. Pompey wanted recognition of his measures in the eastern country for his veterans. Crassus wanted economic advantages and political influence. Caesar wanted the consulate, a large command, and the opportunity to gain military glory. As long as everyone got what they needed, the alliance could work. But such a structure was always fragile. It was based on personal benefit, on mutual calculation, and on the balance of three extraordinary men. As soon as one was missing or one became too strong, the construction had to falter. The first severe blow was the death of Caesar's daughter Julia in 54 BC. Her marriage to Pompey had been far more than a private union. It was a political bond between two of the most powerful men in Rome. In a society where family relationships could strengthen political loyalty, Julia had played an important role. Ancient sources report that Pompey actually loved her, and her death affected him personally. Politically, however, her death meant that one of the strongest human bridges between Caesar and Pompey disappeared. As long as Julia lived, the conflict between her father and her husband was harder to imagine. After her death, relations became cooler, more formal, and more prone to mistrust. The death of Crassus in 53 BC weighed even heavier. Crassus had tried to gain the military glory in the east that he lacked compared to Caesar and Pompey. However, his campaign against the Parthians ended in disaster. At Carrhae, the Roman army was defeated, Crassus himself was killed, and Rome suffered one of the worst defeats in its history. This was a turning point for the Triumvirate. Crassus had not only brought wealth and influence, but also acted as a counterweight between Caesar and Pompey. With his death, a tripartite alliance became a de facto relationship between two men who both had enormous fame and both knew that Rome offered little room for two outstanding power figures in the long run. Pompey had remained in Rome and increasingly became the man on whom many conservative senators relied. This was remarkable, because Pompey had previously been regarded with suspicion even by many optimates. He, too, had received special commandos, led large armies, and stretched republican norms. But compared to Caesar, he now seemed to some to be the lesser risk. Pompey had fame, influence, and authority, but he seemed more predictable. Above all, he was tangible in Rome. Caesar, on the other hand, stood in Gaul, surrounded by battle-hardened legions, strengthened by victories and protected by his command. For the senatorial elite, Caesar became the man who could one day return with an army and a claim that no one could control. In Rome, meanwhile, political disorder intensified. Violence, street fights, and personal allegiances increasingly shaped public life. Politicians such as Clodius and Milo mobilized armed supporters, and the city was at times shaken by unrest. The Senate seemed incapable of establishing order on its own. In this situation, Pompey's importance grew. He eventually became sole consul, which actually contradicted the republican principle of shared power. But the crisis seemed to require extraordinary measures. Once again, the inner weakness of the republic became apparent. In order to save order, it resorted to means that undermined its own principles. Caesar observed this development very closely from Gaul. It was far away, but not cut off. He had friends, agents, and political allies in Rome. He knew that his opponents were waiting for the moment when his command ended. As long as he was proconsul, he had protection from accusations. But as soon as he returned as a private citizen, he could be brought to court for his administration, his legislation in the consulate, or other charges. In Rome, a trial was rarely just a legal matter. It was a political attack, a means of destroying influence, wealth, and honor. Caesar had learned from history that losers in Roman power struggles could not count on leniency. The memory of Sulla, of proscriptions, and of political revenge was still alive. That's why the question of Caesar's future became so explosive. Caesar wanted to run for a second consulate without having to return to Rome as a private citizen first. This would have allowed him to preserve his immunity and legally transfer his political position to the next phase. His opponents, however, wanted to prevent exactly that. They demanded that he resign his command, dismiss his army, and come to Rome in person. Formally, they could invoke republican rules. No general should have legions at his disposal permanently. No man should determine the politics of the capital from a province. But from Caesar's point of view, this demand was not a neutral legal question, but a trap. If he gave up his means of power before his opponents gave up their intentions, he was vulnerable. In this situation, Pompey increasingly sided with the Senate. His relationship with Caesar was not openly hostile from the beginning. Both men had benefited from each other for a long time. Pompey had received political confirmation from Caesar. Caesar had gained support from Pompey. But the balance had changed. Caesar's victories in Gaul made him grow, while Pompey became powerful in Rome, but also dependent on senatorial support. Many optimates worked to bind Pompey more closely to themselves. They flattered him, honored him, and portrayed him as a defender of order. For Pompey, this was tempting, because it gave him the opportunity to appear again as an indispensable man of Rome. A dangerous mistrust arose between Caesar and Pompey. Caesar had to fear that Pompey would abandon him and make common cause with his opponents. Pompey, on the other hand, had to fear that Caesar would return to Rome with his legions and his glory and outflank him. Both men had grown too tall to be easily submissive. In Rome's political culture, which was characterized by dignity, rank, and personal honor, this was decisive. It was not just about offices and laws. It was about the question of who would be the first man in the state. Pompey had long claimed this rank. Caesar had now challenged him. The Senate increased the pressure. Caesar's opponents, especially from the optimatic camp, portrayed his long governorship as a danger to the Republic. They no longer saw his legions as Roman troops, but as Caesar's personal power base. And in fact, this assessment was not wrong. The soldiers had fought under Caesar for years, received booty, experienced victories, and developed a special bond with him. For them, Caesar was not only an official of the state. He was their general, their guarantor of fame, reward, and future. It was precisely this personal loyalty that frightened the republican institutions. An army that trusted its commander more than the Senate was a political explosive charge. Caesar tried not to let the conflict escalate openly immediately. He sought compromises, offered to renounce commands together with Pompey, and had allies negotiate in Rome. But behind every proposal was the basic question of security. Caesar did not want to become defenseless. His opponents did not want to allow him to go into the next political phase armed. Both sides were able to present their position as defenders of the Republic. The Senate said that no citizen should be allowed to blackmail the state with an army. Caesar said that a clique of enemies wanted to destroy him against justice and dignity. This mutual fear made real agreement increasingly unlikely. This is where the tragedy of the late Republic becomes particularly apparent. The institutions were no longer strong enough to create trust. In a functioning system, a former general could certainly have returned, answered to regulated procedures, and continued to work politically afterwards. In Rome, however, neither side believed in fair trials anymore. Court, Senate, popular assembly, religious signs and violence on the streets had long since become weapons. Those who gave up their means of power risked annihilation. Anyone who kept it appeared to be an enemy of the state. Thus, the logic of self-defense led step by step to civil war. Caesar's fame from Gaul thus became a double force. He made him great, but also suspicious. It gave him self-confidence, but also enemies. He tied soldiers to him, but alienated him from republican normality. Pompey's position also changed. The former partner became the possible opponent, the military victor of the East, the man whom the Senate positioned against the victor of Gaul. Crassus was dead, Julia was dead. The old equilibrium was broken. What remained were two men, two centers of power, and a republic that could no longer mediate. At the end of this process, there was no sudden decision, but a slow hardening. Year after year, law by law, mistrust by mistrust, the conflict came closer. Caesar could not simply retreat without risking his dignity, his safety, and perhaps his life. Pompey could not simply give in without jeopardizing his rank and the expectations of his new allies. The Senate could not simply capitulate without admitting that a general with legions was stronger than the Republic. Thus, political rivalry turned into an existential confrontation. Caesar had defeated Gaul, but the victory had put him in a position from which there was no easy way out. His fame had become too great for the old order. His enemies were too determined to remove him from power. His soldiers were too attached to him. Pompey had been pushed too much into the role of defender of the Republic. What had once begun as an alliance of three men crumbled under the weight of death, ambition, fear, and power. The Republic was now faced with the decision of whether to reinstate Caesar or break him. Caesar himself was faced with the decision of whether he would submit or take the final step. The way to the Rubicon was not far away. 12. The Rubicon. The road to the Rubicon was not a spontaneous outburst by an ambitious general, but the result of years of tension, broken alliances, political fear, and mutual distrust. At the end of his Gallic command, Caesar was faced with a decision that would change his life, his career, and the future of Rome. He had long since become too powerful for his opponents in the Senate. For Caesar himself, the demand to resign his command and return to Rome as a private citizen was no longer a normal constitutional expectation, but a mortal danger. Men were waiting in Rome who not only wanted to defeat him politically, but also to destroy him legally. He had humiliated too many enemies, stretched too many rules, won too many victories, and tied too many soldiers to himself. His fame was his protection, but at the same time the reason why his opponents feared him. The situation was so dangerous because both sides saw themselves in the right. The optimatic senators could say that no Roman citizen should have an army at his disposal permanently. The Republic was based on the limitation of personal power. When Caesar continued to lead legions after years in Gaul and exerted political pressure from the provinces, it seemed like a threat to the state order. Anyone who wanted to prevent Rome from falling under the control of a single general had to demand that Caesar dismiss his army. From this perspective, the Senate was not cruel, but vigilant. He wanted to prevent the emergence of a second Sulla, a man who marched with soldiers to Rome and subjected the state to his will. But Caesar saw the matter completely differently. He had experienced how politics worked in Rome. He knew that accusations rarely served only the truth. Trials could be weapons. His opponents could have brought him to justice as soon as he was without office and without military protection. A verdict against him would not only have ended his career, but would also have destroyed his honor and perhaps destroyed his existence. For a Roman aristocrat, the loss of dignitas, i.e. personal dignity and public rank, was almost worse than death. Caesar could hardly imagine standing before his enemies like an ordinary defendant after all his victories. He believed that he was entitled to recognition, not humiliation. Several attempts were made to find a compromise. Caesar offered to resign his command if Pompey did the same. This proposal seemed outwardly just, because it would have disarmed both great power holders equally. But Pompey was now on the side of the Senate and was not prepared to be placed on the same level as Caesar. For the Optimates, Pompey was the tool with which Caesar was to be tamed. For Caesar, however, it was intolerable that he was to be disarmed alone, while his rival continued to retain military and political power. So the conflict revolved around the same question over and over again. Should Caesar trust that his opponents would act fairly, or should he enforce his own security? In the first days of January 49 BC, the crisis finally intensified. The Senate demanded that Caesar dismiss his army. His supporters, including the tribunes Marcus Antonius and Quintus Cassius Longinus, tried to resist. The person of the tribunes of the people was traditionally considered to be particularly protected, because they were supposed to defend the rights of the people against encroachments by the powerful. But in the heated atmosphere of Rome, they were also put under pressure. Finally, they fled to Caesar. For Caesar, this was a gift to his political presentation. He could now claim to be acting not only for himself, but for the violated rights of the tribunes of the people, and thus for the freedom of the Roman people. Whether this was his actual motive is doubtful, but politically it was effective. Caesar could interpret the attack on his allies as an attack on the Republic itself. The Senate resorted to extreme measures and issued the so-called Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree that called on the magistrates to ensure that the state was not harmed. This decision had been used several times in the late Republic, and in fact meant that extraordinary measures against political opponents became possible. For Caesar, this was a clear sign that the political conflict had entered an existential phase. Now it was no longer a matter of individual laws or deadlines. Now the question was who would be considered an enemy of the state. Caesar was in northern Italy at the time, near the border of his province. The Rubicon was a small river, not a huge natural obstacle. Its significance lay not in its size, but in its legal and symbolic function. It marked the border between Caesar's province and Italy. A Roman general was not allowed to lead his troops into Italy simply armed. Anyone who crossed this border with an army went against the order of the Republic. This is exactly why the Rubicon became one of the most famous rivers in history. There, a power struggle that had lasted for years was condensed into a single step. Caesar knew that there would hardly be a return after this step. As long as he remained on the northern side of the river, negotiations could still take place, at least theoretically. As soon as he crossed it with soldiers, political disputes had turned into open civil war. At this moment, ancient tradition puts the famous saying into his mouth that the die has been cast. Whether Caesar actually said these words exactly like that cannot be known for sure, but they sum up the situation aptly. He decided to take the risk. He decided against submission. He chose to defend his dignity and his future with military power. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he did not initially have the enormous army with him that one might expect. He acted with limited forces, but with enormous speed. His strength lay not only in the number of his soldiers, but in his determination and in the insecurity of his opponents. Pompey and the Senate theoretically had large resources, but they were not prepared for Caesar's speed. Many had believed that Caesar would hesitate, negotiate, or play for time. Instead, he created facts. Again, the pattern that had already characterized Gaul emerged. Caesar took the initiative, forced his opponents to react, and turned speed into a political weapon. His message was carefully chosen. He did not present his march as an attack on Rome, but as a defense of his rights, his honor, and the rights of the tribunes of the people. He claimed that he wanted to protect the freedom of the Roman people and break the power of a small clique. His opponents, on the other hand, saw him as a traitor who marched against his fatherland with armed legions. Both interpretations were powerful, and both were carried by fear. Caesar feared humiliation and annihilation. The Senate feared tyranny. Pompey feared being overtaken by Caesar's glory and determination. Thus began a war in which each side claimed to save the Republic, while both continued to destroy it. The march to Italy was initially surprisingly successful for Caesar. Many cities opened their gates to him. Resistance collapsed faster than his opponents had expected. One reason for this was Caesar's reputation. His soldiers were considered experienced, his victories impressive, his determination fearsome. Another reason was the insecurity of many local elites. Who should win in the end? Pompey, the famous general of the East, or Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul? In a civil war, early partisanship is dangerous. Many opted for adaptation or cautious cooperation. Caesar took advantage of this by showing leniency. He often spared opponents instead of punishing them harshly immediately. This clementia, this demonstrative leniency, was politically clever. It distinguished him outwardly from Sulla's bloody vengeance, and made it easier for the undecided to go over to him. But mildness was not only humanity. It was strategy. Caesar did not want to appear as the destroyer of Italy. He needed legitimacy. If he had Roman citizens killed en masse or cities devastated, he would have confirmed the propaganda of his opponents. Instead, he presented himself as a measured victor, a man who fought against a political clique, not against Rome itself. In doing so, he weakened the resistance. Those who surrendered had reason to hope. Those who hoped fought less determinedly. Caesar's clemency was therefore part of his warfare, as effective as a fast march or a good order of battle. Pompey and many senators finally decided to leave Italy and cross over to Greece. For many Romans, this seemed like a retreat, perhaps even an escape. Pompey had hoped to be able to gather his stronger client networks, troops, and resources in the east. Strategically, this was understandable. Politically, however, it gave Caesar the opportunity to bring Rome and Italy into his hands largely without a fight. The man who allegedly threatened the Republic was now standing in the capital, while its self-proclaimed defenders had left it. Caesar was able to use this impression to his advantage. The Rubicon was therefore not only the beginning of a civil war. It was the moment when the old Republic lost its last authority. If a general could march into Italy with his legions because he no longer trusted the institutions, and if the Senate had to rely on another general to stop him, then the Republican balance was already broken. The river itself was small, but the step over it was huge. He showed that political conflicts in Rome could no longer be resolved through procedures, compromises, and trust. In the end, armies decided. For Caesar, the Rubicon meant the final transformation. The successful proconsul became a civil war leader. The defender of his dignitas became a man who was ready to force Rome with military force. The conqueror of Gaul became the challenger to the entire old order. He may not have had a ready-made plan for a monarchy, but he had taken the decisive step that made a return to normality hardly possible. Anyone who had once marched into Italy with an army could no longer simply claim to be just an ordinary servant of the Republic. To this day, the Rubicon stands as a symbol of a decision that cannot be reversed. But in Caesar's case, that moment was not just personal audacity. It was the result of a republic that could no longer resolve its conflicts peacefully, an elite that preferred to block rather than balance, a general who had grown too big to be made small, and a political system in which fear had become stronger than trust. Caesar crossed the Rubicon with a few troops, but behind him were years of ambition, glory, insult, and violence. Ahead of him lay Rome, the civil war, and a new order that no one could yet clearly recognize. The die had been cast, and with them another piece of the Roman Republic fell. 13. Civil war against Pompey. By the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon, years of political tension had turned into open civil war. But this war did not begin with a great decisive battle, but with movement, uncertainty, and psychological pressure. Caesar knew he had to act quickly. His situation was more dangerous than his later fame suggests. Although he had battle-hardened troops and a formidable name, Pompey had great prestige, connections in the East, the support of many senators, and the reputation of a man who had previously decided entire wars. If Caesar hesitated, his opponents could rally. If Pompey gained time, he could mobilize the enormous resources of the Roman Empire against him. Caesar therefore relied on what had already distinguished him in Gaul: speed, determination, and the ability to force his opponents to react. The advance through Italy showed how much the Republic was already paralyzed internally. Many cities did not offer Caesar any serious resistance. Some opened their gates to him, others waited, and still others changed sides out of caution. The old order had found great words against Caesar, but it had not organized a united defense. Pompey himself recognized that Italy could not be held at the moment. He decided to cross over to Greece with a large part of the Senate in order to gather new troops there and use his power base in the east. Strategically, this was not pointless. Pompey had created enormous networks of patronage in the east. Kings and cities owed him gratitude or feared his influence, and there he was able to build up a larger military force in peace. Politically, however, his withdrawal had a devastating effect. The man who was supposed to save the Republic left Rome, but Caesar advanced and suddenly appeared as the one who established order in Italy. Caesar used this moment masterfully. He did not present himself as an avenger, but as a man of mildness. He often released captured opponents, he treated senators with demonstrative restraint, and he avoided antagonizing Italy by blood and plunder. This leniency was not only an expression of personal greatness, but a calculated means of power. Caesar wanted to distinguish himself from Sulla, whose name was still associated with proscriptions, expropriations, and terror. He wanted to show that his war was not directed against Rome, but against a small group of opponents who allegedly wanted to deprive him of his rights. Those who surrendered should be allowed to hope. Those who were allowed to hope often fought less determinedly. Caesar's clementia thus became a weapon that weakened resistance and made his rule seem bearable. But before Caesar could pursue Pompey directly, he had to secure the western provinces. In Spain there were strong troops loyal to Pompey. Caesar knew that he could not go to Greece as long as there was a Pompeian power base behind him. He is said to have said that he was going first against an army without a general, then against a general without an army. This formulation shows his strategic clarity. Pompey himself was in the east, but his legions in Spain could become dangerous. So Caesar first turned west. The campaign in Spain was not a brilliant triumphal procession, but a difficult struggle marked by supplies, maneuvers, and political conviction. Caesar not only had to win, but also win over or neutralize the enemy soldiers as much as possible. In the end, he succeeded. The Pompeian forces in Spain were eliminated without Caesar having to wear out his main force in a devastating decisive battle. After the securing of the West, the focus turned to Pompey. The real big opponent was Greece. There Pompey had gained time, gathered troops, organized fleets, and received the support of numerous senators and allies. His situation was by no means hopeless. On the contrary, many observers would have considered Pompey to be the favorite. He controlled the sea routes better, had large supplies, and was able to make it more difficult for Caesar to cross. Caesar, however, was not prepared to let the opponent take the initiative. Despite adverse conditions, he crossed over to Greece. The crossing was risky, because not all of his troops could follow immediately. For a time, Caesar faced an opponent who was theoretically stronger with limited forces. But it was precisely such risky situations that corresponded to his nature. He trusted in speed, determination, and the moral impact of his presence. In Greece, two very different concepts of war collided. Pompey wanted to starve Caesar as much as possible, tire him out and weaken him through his superior supply situation. He didn't have to look for a quick decision. Time worked for him at first. The longer Caesar remained in a difficult situation, the more hunger, exhaustion, and supply problems could burden his army. Caesar, on the other hand, needed movement and decision. He could not afford a long war of attrition in which Pompey played out his superior resources. With Dyrrhachium, Caesar was indeed in serious danger. Pompey managed to break through Caesar's lines and inflict losses on him. It was one of the few situations in which Caesar was clearly in trouble. Later, Caesar is said to have said that Pompey could have won that day if he had known how to win. This remark is of course biased, but it shows how close some moments were. After Dyrrhachium, Caesar was battered, but not defeated. This is exactly where his strength in the crisis showed up again. He withdrew in an orderly manner, gathered his strength and prevented a setback from turning into a breakdown. Pompey, on the other hand, was under pressure from his senatorial companions. Many of them finally wanted the decision. They considered Caesar's position weak and urged Pompey to seek battle. Pompey himself was more cautious. He knew that Caesar and his veterans were dangerous in open combat. But politics and war could not be separated. Pompey led not only an army, but also a coalition of senators, ambitious, exiles and men who made their future dependent on the victory over Caesar. These people demanded the decisive blow. In 48 BC, for example, the Battle of Pharsalos in Thessaly took place. On paper, Pompey had advantages. His army was larger, especially his cavalry was superior. His plan was to overwhelm Caesar's right flank with cavalry and roll up the enemy line. Caesar recognized this danger and set up a reserve behind his front, which was intended precisely for this moment. When Pompey's cavalry attacked and seemed to succeed at first, they met Caesar's prepared troops. The attack lost its power, the Pompeian cavalry was thrown back, and Caesar's men were able to threaten the enemy's flank. Then Caesar's veterans advanced. The greater number of Pompeians could not compensate for the better experience and discipline of the Caesarians. Pompey's army collapsed. Pharsalos was more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of the political hope of stopping Caesar through Pompey. Many senators fled, others surrendered, and still others sought new centers of resistance. Pompey himself fled to Egypt. There he hoped for help from the young king Ptolemy XIII, whose reign was in internal conflict. But Pompey was not received as a savior, but as a risk. The Egyptian advisors decided to have him assassinated in order to please Caesar or at least not to become enemies with him. When Pompey arrived on the coast of Egypt, he was killed. His head was later given to Caesar. Caesar's reaction to Pompey's death is remarkable. He is said to have shown grief and disgust. Whether this was pure staging or real movement cannot be judged with certainty. It was probably both. Pompey had been his opponent, but also his former ally and son-in-law. Above all, however, he was a great Roman. His murder by foreign hands violated the Roman sense of dignity. Caesar was able to present himself as the generous victor who disliked the killing of his defeated rival. Here, too, feeling, politics, and self-expression were combined. A living Pompey would have remained dangerous. A murdered Pompey became a symbol of the end of an era. But Pompey's death did not completely end the civil war. The Pompeian cause lived on, carried by men who would never accept Caesar. Opponents gathered in North Africa, including Cato the Younger, who became a moral symbol of republican intransigence for many. Later, Caesar had to fight Pompeian forces again in Spain. Nevertheless, Pharsalos was the decisive break. The greatest rival had been defeated, the most famous general besides Caesar was dead, and the Senate had lost its strongest military support. The civil war against Pompey showed how far the Republic had fallen. Both sides claimed to be fighting for Rome. Pompey and the Optimates saw themselves as defenders of freedom against a man who enforced his personal power with legions. Caesar saw himself as a defender of his dignity and the rights of the people against an aristocratic clique that wanted to destroy him. Both accounts were not completely false, but both also concealed power interests. Pompey defended not only a pure republic, but also his own rank. Caesar fought not only against injustice, but also for his supremacy. In the end, it was not decided who had the better arguments, but who had the stronger legions, the better strategy, and the more determined will. For Caesar, the victory meant a huge increase in his power. He had taken Italy, secured Spain, defeated Pompey, and crushed the principal resistance of the senatorial party. But each victory moved him further away from the old republican normality. How could a man who had defeated his opponents militarily simply be one among many senators again? How could a Senate deliberate freely when Caesar's veterans, Caesar's fame, and Caesar's decisions were paramount? The Civil War had made Caesar the dominant figure, but at the same time it had exacerbated the question of what order was still possible after the victory. Pompey's defeat was therefore not only the end of a rival. It was the end of the illusion that the Republic could be saved by one great man against another great man. The Senate had relied on Pompey because it feared Caesar. But in doing so, he himself had acknowledged that the old institutions could no longer exist without military power. Caesar won the war, but the real loser was the Republic. For after Pharsalos it was clear that Rome's future was no longer determined by the balance of offices, traditions and discussions, but by the will of the victor. And that victor was Caesar. 14. Dictator, reformer, autocrat. After defeating Pompey and the main forces of the senatorial opposition, Caesar was faced with a task that was perhaps more difficult than any campaign. He had to dominate a ruined political order without immediately appearing like a king. Rome was exhausted by civil war, mistrust, and years of violence. The old institutions still existed, but their inner meaning was severely damaged. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates continued to be elected, laws could be passed, and yet everyone knew that the real power now lay with Caesar. His legions, his fame, his victories, and his ability to spare or destroy opponents made him the center of the state. The Republic still existed on the outside, but it increasingly moved in the shadow of a single man. Caesar had several chances after his victory. Like Sulla, he could have established an open reign of terror and persecuted his opponents en masse. He could have brutally cleansed the old order and installed a new elite from among his supporters. But he chose a different path. He relied on leniency, on reconciliation, and on the attempt to integrate former opponents into his order. This clementia, his much-vaunted mildness, became a central part of his political image. Caesar wanted to show that he was not acting out of vindictiveness. Men who had fought against him could be pardoned. Senators who had followed Pompey were allowed to return. Many regained their dignity and, in some cases, their influence. That seemed generous, but it was also a clever strategy. A state based only on fear remained restless. A defeated opponent who was allowed to hope was easier to integrate. But this leniency had a contradictory effect. For Caesar's followers, it was a sign of his greatness. For some opponents, it was humiliating. Those who were pardoned had to acknowledge that their lives and political existence depended on Caesar's mercy. The clementia made Caesar the judge of the dignity of other men. In an aristocratic society where personal honor and rank were of enormous importance, a pardon could seem almost like a reminder of submission. Some senators found it hard to bear to owe their political survival to a man they believed to be the destroyer of the Republic. Caesar's clemency thus generated gratitude, but also hidden hatred. Officially, Caesar received extraordinary powers. He was appointed dictator several times, first for a limited period of time, later for a longer period of time, and finally even for life. The office of dictator was not completely foreign in the Roman tradition. In earlier times, a dictator could be installed in severe crises who was given special power for a short time to save the state. But Caesar's dictatorship was fundamentally different from this old emergency office. It was no longer understood as a brief state of emergency, but as the basis of lasting rule. This was exactly where the break lay. Caesar could claim to hold a Roman office. His opponents, however, saw that this office took on a new meaning in his hands. It created a position of power that was hardly compatible with republican equality. Nevertheless, Caesar was not only a ruler who was intoxicated with titles. He actually tried to put the state in order. After decades of civil war, social tension, and administrative problems, there was much to reform. One of his best-known measures was the calendar reform. The old Roman calendar had become inaccurate and was also politically manipulated because officials could influence the length of a year by interpolating it. With the help of Alexandrian experts, Caesar introduced the Julian calendar, which aligned the year much better with the course of the sun. This reform was practical, permanent, and shows Caesar's sense of administration. It had an impact far beyond his own time and shaped the calendar of Europe for many centuries. Caesar also intervened in settlement and social policy. He founded colonies, settled veterans and poor citizens, and tried to relieve the overcrowded capital. Rome was a huge, troubled city with many dispossessed people, clients, day laborers, and people who depended on grain distributions. Caesar reduced the number of those who received state-supported grain and at the same time tried to create new livelihoods outside Rome. This was not only social policy, but also power politics. Veterans who received land remained connected to Caesar and his memory. Poor citizens who found a future in colonies could become bearers of Roman rule in the provinces. Caesar thus combined care, order, and imperial expansion. Another important area was the provincial administration. The Roman provinces had been an opportunity for enrichment for many governors. Tax collectors, local elites, and Roman officials could place a heavy burden on the population. Caesar tried to curb exploitation and to put the administration in a stronger order. This was not about modern equality or self-determination, but about stability. An empire that had been squeezed too hard became restless. Caesar thought imperial. He wanted to use the provinces not only as booty, but as a permanent basis for Roman power. The expansion of citizenship also played a role in this. By granting rights to selected communities and individuals, Caesar bound new groups more closely to Rome and to his own rule. His expansion of the Senate was particularly controversial. Caesar significantly increased the number of senators and accepted men from Italy and the provinces, including many of his supporters. From his point of view, this made sense. Rome was no longer just the city of old families. The empire had grown larger. Its ruling class had to become broader. From the point of view of many traditional senators, however, this was an attack on the dignity of their class. They saw the Senate watered down by new men, filled by Caesar's followers, and deprived of its old authority. What Caesar understood as an adaptation to the reality of the empire was perceived by many as humiliation. The Senate became larger, but not necessarily freer. He became more representative of Caesar's new order, but less independent of Caesar's power. Caesar also planned large construction projects. He wanted to beautify Rome, order it, and adapt it to its status as the center of a world empire. The Forum Iulium, the Temple of Venus Genitrix, and other projects showed how closely architecture, religion, and self-expression were linked. Caesar linked his family to Venus, the divine progenitor of the Julii, and made this lineage publicly visible. In doing so, he elevated his political position to an almost sacred space. He was not only a victor in the civil war, but a man with divinely charged origins, a benefactor of the city, a steward of time, and a founder of a new future. This was impressive for his supporters. For his opponents, it could seem frightening. For the more Caesar was honored, the stronger the suspicion grew that he was striving for royal power. The Romans abhorred the title of king due to historical tradition. Since the expulsion of the kings, the monarchy was considered a symbol of servitude and arbitrariness. But Caesar received honors that seemed dangerously monarchical to many. His image was minted on coins, which was unusual for a living Roman. He received special seats, special clothing, statues, and religiously charged awards. He was allowed to wear the laurel wreath and appeared more and more as a towering figure above the other citizens. Perhaps Caesar did not simply want to become king in the old sense. Perhaps he was looking for a new form of autocracy that combined Roman traditions with personal power. But for many senators, the difference was hardly reassuring. The decisive factor was not only what title Caesar bore, but that no one was really standing next to him anymore. The scene at the Lupercalia festival in 44 BC became a symbol of this fear. Marcus Antony publicly offered Caesar a diadem, a sign of royal dignity. Caesar rejected it, but the effect was ambivalent. Was the rejection proof of his republican restraint? Or was the whole scene a test to see if the people would be willing to accept him as king? The ancient sources leave room for interpretation. The only thing that is certain is that the question of kingship was in the air. Even if Caesar did not accept the title, his power already seemed more regal than anything the Republic could bear. At the same time, Caesar was preparing new military plans. A great campaign against the Parthians was in the air, the power in the east against which Crassus had perished at Carrhae. A victory over the Parthians would have brought Caesar still greater glory and avenged the disgrace of Rome. But for his opponents, that was also threatening. If Caesar left Rome to win new victories in the east, his power would continue to grow. If he returned, he might be unassailable for good. Some might therefore believe that only rapid action could stop him. The central tension of his reign was that Caesar recognized and tackled many of the real problems of the Republic, but did so from a position of power that destroyed Republican freedom. His reforms were not just a facade. They could be useful, modernizing, and effective in the long term. However, they were not decided in a free political equilibrium, but under the pressure of his supreme authority. Caesar rebuilt the state, but he did it as the victor of a civil war. This made every reform ambiguous. Was it healing or securing power? Was it necessary or an expression of personal power? Often she was both at the same time. For ordinary citizens, veterans, and many people in the provinces, Caesar could well appear as a beacon of hope. He brought order after years of violence, distributed land, created colonies, opened up opportunities for advancement, and thought the empire larger than the old senatorial families. For many aristocrats, however, he was the man who destroyed their political world. They couldn't just dismiss him as a tyrant because he was actually capable. That was precisely what made him dangerous. An incompetent tyrant would have been easier to hate. Caesar, however, combined power with talent, ambition with the power to reform, mildness with dominance, and personal greatness with the institutional disempowerment of his opponents. At the end of his reign, Rome was in a state of tense calm. The great opponents had been defeated, most open wars had ended domestically, reforms had begun, and the future seemed to be in Caesar's hands. But beneath the surface, the unease grew. Many senators wondered whether there was still a republic at all. Others feared that Caesar would return after the Parthian campaign as an untouchable ruler. Still others found the constant submission to his grace unbearable. Caesar had stabilized the state, but not reconciled it. He had pardoned opponents, but had not convinced them. He had renewed order, but had not restored confidence in common freedom. As a dictator, Caesar thus became the most contradictory figure of his time. He was a reformer and autocrat, benefactor and victor, steward and destroyer of the old order. His power solved problems that the Republic could no longer cope with, but at the same time it proved that this Republic was barely alive. Caesar no longer stood only in the Republic. He stood above her. And that was exactly what was unbearable for those men who still saw themselves as guardians of the old freedom. While Caesar planned new campaigns and consolidated his order, the idea matured in secret that the man had to be killed in order to save the Republic. But whether a republic that could only be saved by murder could be saved at all remained the gloomy question that hung over Caesar's last days. 15. The Ides of March and Caesar's legacy. On March 15, 44 BC, the day that was to go down in world history as the Ides of March, the tension over Caesar reached its deadly peak. Rome was outwardly calm, but a deep conflict was brewing under the surface. Caesar was a dictator for life, victor of the civil war, reformer of the state, and undisputed center of power. For his followers, he was the man who had brought order to chaos. For his veterans, he was the general to whom they owed fame, booty, and future. For many ordinary citizens, he was a generous benefactor who distributed land, founded colonies, and challenged the ossified power of the old noble families. To his opponents, however, he was something else, a man who had transformed the Republic into personal rule, a dictator whose power seemed more regal every day and whose further rise seemed almost unstoppable. The conspiracy against Caesar did not arise from a single motive. It was a mixture of republican conviction, personal insult, aristocratic fear, and political despair. Some of the conspirators actually believed they were acting in the name of freedom. Men like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus saw Caesar as a tyrant whose power finally suffocated the old order. Brutus played a special role in this, because his name was symbolically charged. He came from a family that linked its origins to Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary man who was said to have expelled the Roman kings. For many Romans, this name was inextricably linked with the freedom of the Republic. When a Brutus rose up against a new autocrat, it seemed like a repetition of the founding myth of the Republic. But the motives of the conspirators were not all as pure as they themselves might have wanted to portray. Some were indebted to Caesar's personal grace and felt that very grace as humiliation. Others had stood against him in the Civil War and could never accept his victory inwardly. Still others feared that Caesar's reforms and his expansion of the Senate would cause them to lose their old social primacy. Caesar had pardoned many opponents, but he had not given them back the feeling of being truly free and equal. Those who lived under his mildness lived under his superiority. In a world where honor and rank meant everything, even grace could act like a chain. It seemed particularly threatening to many that Caesar was preparing a major campaign against the Parthians. This war would have led him out of Rome and, if successful, would have given him even greater fame. The Parthians were the power against which Crassus had failed so catastrophically at Carrhae. A victory over them would not only have restored Rome's honor, but would have raised Caesar once and for all living Romans. His opponents feared that he would return unassailable after such a triumph. If they wanted to act, they had to do it before he left Rome. Time was working against them. In addition, there was the constantly recurring fear of royalty. Caesar had publicly rejected the title of king, but his position remained unbearably monarchical for many. The honors he received, his appointment as dictator for life, his image on coins, his special clothing, his elevated seating position, and his almost sacred rank blurred the boundaries between republican office and personal rule. Perhaps Caesar did not want to be king in the ancient Roman sense. Perhaps he was looking for a new form of rule that combined Roman traditions with permanent sole power. But for the senators, who saw themselves as free men of a republic, this difference was hardly consoling. They only saw that Caesar was standing above them. On the morning of the Ides of March, there are said to have been warnings. Caesar's wife Calpurnia had a bad dream and begged him not to go to the Senate. Fortune-tellers are also said to have warned him of this day. Such accounts are difficult to separate from later dramatization, but they show how strongly Caesar's death was already felt as a fateful moment in ancient memory. Caesar reportedly hesitated, but was then persuaded to appear at the Senate meeting after all. For a man like him, public absence out of fear was hardly imaginable. He had built his whole life on not avoiding danger. Perhaps he underestimated the determination of the conspirators. Perhaps he believed that his grace had created enough protection. Perhaps he thought the senatorial opponents were too weak to really strike. The session did not take place in the actual Senate building, but in Pompey's Curia. This place alone was symbolically deeply charged. Pompey, Caesar's great rival, was dead, but his name was still in the air. In front of a statue of the man Caesar had defeated in the Civil War, Caesar himself was to fall. The conspirators approached him under the pretext of a request. Then they drew their daggers. The attack was chaotic and brutal. Caesar was hit by numerous stabs. In the later tradition, the moment when he recognizes Brutus among the attackers seems particularly shocking. The famous sentence, "You too, my son," belongs more to the dramatic tradition than to established history, but it expresses what the scene meant for later generations. Not only a political opponent killed Caesar, but men to whom he had granted closeness, trust, or mercy. Caesar did not die on a battlefield, not at the head of his legions and not in an open duel, but in the center of Roman politics, surrounded by senators. His death was thus itself an image of the crisis of the Republic. The men who killed him believed that the murder would restore freedom, but they had no viable plan for the time afterwards. That was her decisive mistake. They had killed the man who stood above the Republic, but they could not simply bring the Republic back to life as it had once been. The social conflicts, the veterans, the power of the armies, the expectations of the population, the weakened institutions, and the personal rivalries did not disappear with Caesar's blood. At first, there was uncertainty. The conspirators hoped that the people would celebrate them as liberators. But the reaction was much more unclear. Many senators were relieved, others horrified, ordinary citizens wavered between fear, curiosity, and anger, and Caesar's veterans saw the death of their general as a betrayal. Mark Antony, Caesar's close confidant and politically experienced power seeker, quickly recognized the opportunity. At Caesar's funeral, he succeeded in turning the mood against the murderers. Caesar's will, his gifts to the people, and the public presentation of his bloody robe made a martyr out of the slain dictator. The conspirators had hoped to eliminate the tyrant. Instead, they created an even more powerful memory. Caesar's death did not trigger a return to the old order, but a new round of civil wars. Antony, Octavian, the later Augustus, Lepidus, Brutus, Cassius, and other power holders fought over the inheritance of the murdered man. Especially Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and main heir, knew how to turn the name Caesar into political power. He was young, underestimated, and initially without a great military past of his own, but he possessed something priceless: the name of the dead man and the claim to his legacy. The murder of Caesar did not lead to the salvation of the Republic, but to a new monarchy that disguised itself more skillfully. Augustus was later to avoid openly appearing as king, but he created a permanent autocracy that emerged from the ruins of the Republic. Caesar's legacy is therefore contradictory. He was an extraordinary general, a brilliant politician, a gifted writer, and a reformer with a broad vision. He realized that Rome could no longer be governed like a city-state when it had long since become a world empire. His measures in the calendar, administration, civil rights, colonization, and social order showed a real will to shape things. He thought bigger than many of his opponents, who often only wanted to preserve the old aristocratic order, although this order was already failing. But Caesar was also a man who put personal power above republican limitations. He waged a civil war, crossed the border into Italy with his legions, and allowed himself to be elevated to a position that seemed to many Romans like the end of political freedom. The question of whether Caesar destroyed the Republic or merely accelerated its collapse, which had already begun, therefore remains difficult to answer. The Republic was already deeply damaged before Caesar. Social tensions, violence, corruption, personal armies, overpowering generals, and the inability of the Senate to compromise had undermined it. Caesar was not the source of all these crises, but he was the man who used it most successfully, and thus finally made it visible that the old order could no longer be sustained. He was both symptom and cause, the product of a sick republic, and at the same time the one who gave it the final blow. His death shows the tragedy of Roman history in concentrated form. The conspirators killed Caesar to save freedom, but they did not understand that freedom needs more than the death of a powerful man. It needs institutions, trust, common rules, and the willingness to limit power. All this had already become too weak in Rome. Caesar had taken advantage of this weakness, but his murderers could not cure it. So his blood did not become the beginning of a renewed republic, but the prelude to further violence. In the end, Caesar remained greater in death than he might ever have been in life. His name became a title, symbol, and myth. Caesar later became emperor, czar, and other ruler titles. His life became the stuff of historians, playwrights, politicians, and generals. To this day, it stands for power, ambition, genius, and danger. Anyone who looks at Caesar sees not only a man of antiquity, but a timeless question: how much power can an individual receive if he promises order? And what happens to a republic when its citizens trust the institutions less than strong men? Caesar's story does not end with the daggers of the conspirators. It begins there in a new way. His death opened the way to Augustus, the Principate, and the Roman Empire. The republic for which Brutus and Cassius believed they were fighting did not return. Instead, a new order emerged that bore Caesar's name and preserved his teachings. Power did not always have to be openly royal to have a monarchical effect. Caesar fell on the Ides of March, but his shadow fell over the following centuries. Rome killed the dictator, but it did not escape the world he had created.